Hello. First time here? Welcome. If you're back for more, it's great to have you. Where are you watching from and what time is it? Drop a comment below. Now sit back and relax. I often enjoy walking my dog at night, mostly because it's easier for me. My dog, Loki, has a tendency to act up when there are other people around, especially with their own dogs. So, we usually take walks around parks when they've become quieter, usually later in the evening. I'm not a big guy, about 5 feet 10 inches and lanky, so I wouldn't exactly be considered intimidating. However, my 120-pound black boxer, Loki, is often perceived as a bit threatening to others, based on what I've heard. I figured Loki's size would act as a deterrent to anyone looking for trouble at night. I was completely wrong. One particular night in the fall of 2016, I had an experience that reminds me why I'm often hesitant to walk after dark. This specific park was one I had visited a few times, and from what I remembered, it was usually pretty empty around 6:30 p.m. and later. Aside from a few joggers, there weren't many other dog walkers around. I usually take a less popular route and like to listen to music with my headphones while walking. But on this night, I chose not to wear them because my phone was running low on battery, and I wanted to save it for as long as possible. The walk was going as usual. Loki did his business, and we continued down our usual path. But midway through the walk, I noticed it was getting really dark. Since Loki was done, I decided to cut the walk short and take a shortcut that led us off the main path. The shortcut had a lot of trees around it, and the branches still had leaves on them. That's when I started to feel something weird, like I was being watched. I have anxiety, so I tried to brush it off. I told myself the town was safe and nothing was going to happen, but I just couldn't shake the feeling. I kept looking back, convinced someone might be following us, but every time I did, there was nothing. In fact, the area was completely empty. This shortcut was secluded. Suddenly, Loki stopped and looked behind us. I called out, "Loki, come on boy, let's go." One thing I hadn't mentioned earlier is that Loki is a huge coward. His tail was tucked between his legs, a clear sign that he was scared. I was starting to feel uneasy too, but I really didn't want to find out what had him on edge. I just wanted to get out of there. I gave him a little tug, and he started walking again, but every now and then, I'd see him glance back. After a minute or so, he stopped again, and this time he began to growl. Despite being a coward, Loki's usually more bark than bite. So I took this chance to see exactly what he was growling at. It was quite dark, so I could not see well. So I used my phone's flashlight to see what was up. Trees. Just trees. What he heard was probably some kind of small animal. Once again, I turned around and kept walking. He continued to peer back once in a while still, but this time I noticed it was a lot more frequent. I just said to myself, just squirrels, maybe a bird, and I ignored it. Then, I heard what appeared to be actual footsteps and branches breaking. There is absolutely no way a small animal could have produced a sound like that. Loki turned around quick, and still with his tail tucked, he began to growl and bark at a figure that I could only describe as a man in his early 50s, possibly late 40s, appear from out of the woods. He was dressed in dirty clothing. His hair was long and was graying. He had one hand in his pocket, and he said to me, "Nice dog you have. What breed is he?" "He's a boxer," I replied. "Oh, I love dogs. Mind if I pet them?" He wondered. The man got closer and emerged from the trees. As he got closer, I realized that he was quite tall and a bit burly. Loki instantly got bad vibes. He ran behind me and started to bark at him. Actually, I do kind of mind. My dog here doesn't like strangers. Sorry, but it's probably not best if you pet him. I quickly stated. It's okay, really. He seems like a friendly guy. Just a little pet wouldn't harm him. The man retorted as he got closer. I felt extremely uncomfortable, as he appeared to get closer and closer. I don't know why this guy couldn't take no for an answer. I mean, I usually don't allow people to pet Loki unless he comes up to them first. If he's scared of you, then I usually do not want to freak him out by letting him be pet by a stranger. This is especially the case when said stranger came from the woods behind a few trees. "I'm really sorry, man. I'm scared he'd bite you or something," I told him as I began to walk away. Like I said before, I wasn't trying to be judgmental or anything, but the dude came from the woods and was possibly the one trailing us from before. I don't know why he won't just let me introduce myself to him, the guy replied angrily. This time I began to speed walk. I was very uncomfortable, and my fight or flight instincts began to take over. He followed us and kept muttering curses to himself. I don't know if this man was under the influence of something, but he did not let up. I won't lie, I started to get a little angry. Why can't a guy just take no for an answer? He began to match my speed, almost as if he was trying to catch up to us. Loki and I both took this as an answer to start sprinting a bit. I don't remember much of the running. It was all a blur to me, but I do remember the spine-tingling feeling of hearing his footsteps rapidly increasing behind me. For a man of his stature, he was quite fast. I also realized that his intentions may not have been to just pet my dog. No one reasonable would go that far just to pet a dog that clearly wanted nothing to do with him. I looked behind me and he was in pursuit. Maybe about 10 feet behind me, he was chasing us. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. I've never had anyone look at me like that before. It was a look filled with pure killer intent. And for what? Just because he couldn't pet my dog? My instincts told me there was something very wrong about it. Finally, the path led us out of the park and onto the busier streets. I lived about 10 minutes away, so I kept checking to make sure no one was following me, sticking to well-lit, populated areas. Felt like an eternity, but eventually, we made it home. But I knew there was no way I was going to sleep that night. I kept watch from the porch window with Loki by my side, just to make sure no one had followed us. I also made a police report with my parents because honestly, this guy seemed suspicious. What were his true intentions? Was he targeting someone vulnerable, someone who couldn't protect themselves or run away? I can't help but wonder, what would he have done if I hadn't noticed him? What if I had been wearing my headphones and the music had drowned out the sound of his footsteps? Ever since that night, I haven't taken Loki to that park again. I also make sure to stick to livelier streets when I walk at night. If I could give anyone one piece of advice, it would be this. Even if you live in a relatively safe town, never let your guard down. You never know who might be lurking in the shadows. When I was around 16 or 17, I was walking back home from a party at my friend's place. The streets were desolate and unnervingly quiet as I made my way down the road leading to my house. My watch beeped, marking the hour, and I glanced at it, 3 a.m. I wasn't the type to go to parties or stay out so late. Honestly, I could count on one hand how many times I came home after midnight during high school. I was a good kid, and my parents knew all of my friends. All I had to do was tell them who I was with, what time I'd be back, and call them before I left my friends' places, and I had no curfew. But since I wasn't used to being out this late, the quiet streets felt unsettling. Normally, they were full of life with people out and about, living their normal routines. The stillness gave the walk an eerie feeling. I was just 2 short blocks from the bridge that led to my house when I saw a hooded figure step off the bridge, walking straight toward me. That bridge, however, was known for being a dangerous spot for muggings and other crimes. I had always been warned to avoid it at night and take the long way around. But being a teenager, I didn't listen. Seeing the figure made me regret not heeding those warnings. Even from a distance, he radiated a menacing presence. Still, I tried to convince myself I was tough, thinking that if anything happened, I could handle it. So I kept walking toward him. That was a huge mistake. As I got closer, something incredibly strange occurred. Another hooded figure appeared from behind the first, falling in step with him. Then a third emerged, and from the third, a fourth. It was like the first person had somehow multiplied into 4. They all moved with such perfect synchronization. It was as if they were one entity, and their matching appearance, same height, same build, made it impossible to tell them apart. For hooded figures, all in sync, walking toward me. I'd seen creepy things before, but nothing like this. Every part of me screamed to run, and I realized I wasn't nearly as brave as I thought. I quickly crossed to the other side of the street, hoping to take the longer route home. To my horror, they mirrored my movement. I quickened my pace and made it to the corner before they did, nearly breaking into a jog. At one point, I was close enough to get a glimpse of them, but all their faces were completely hidden by their hoods. I couldn't even make out their chins or noses. It was just darkness, almost as if they had no faces. I was just about to start sprinting in abject terror when suddenly I found my backbone and decided I would not run from whatever they were. I took a deep breath and, summoning all my courage, I turned around to face them. They were gone. I looked around for them, but they were nowhere in sight. They had completely disappeared. There was no place they really could have gone, however. They weren't close enough to any buildings to have gotten into. In fact, they were right behind me. I didn't spend too long searching for the creepy hooded figures, however, and 10 minutes later, I was home. As soon as I entered my house, my mother comes from out of her bedroom and approaches me and asked, "Are you okay?" And thought maybe she didn't remember me calling her before leaving my friend's house. "I'm fine, Mom. We spoke an hour ago. I told you I'd be home at this time." "You did," she confirmed. "But after I spoke to you, I fell asleep. Then suddenly I was awoken by an angel that told me, 'Your son is in danger. Come with me.'" My mother was and still is a Christian, as am I, so hearing her speak about angels wasn't uncommon. But her saying she went somewhere with one wasn't your average dinner conversation in my house. The angel led my spirit into a room where there were a bunch of other teenagers that were chanting around a table, and they had a picture of you on the table and their words sounded foreign. It felt like they were trying to send something after you, my mom explained. I swallowed hard. What happened next? I asked her hesitantly. The angel prompted me to step forward onto their table. So I did, and suddenly, I was wearing this beautiful white gown and the kids that were chanting could see me, and they all fled in terror. I think I disrupted whatever they were trying to do. "Mom, when did this happen?" I asked, although I already knew. "Just now, like maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago," she responded. Couldn't believe it. That was about the same time those guys appeared. Was there any connection between my mom's vision and the 4 hooded figures? I don't know. But all I do know is that I don't ever want to meet those hooded guys again. In the mid-1800s, a significant wave of people from the eastern United States began migrating westward, drawn by the promise of a new life in California or the recently acquired Oregon territories. For many, the move represented a chance to escape financial hardships or practice their religious beliefs freely, away from the scrutiny of their communities back east. Others were enticed by the economic potential of the West or fueled by the idea of manifest destiny. However, for one group of migrants, their pursuit of a better life would quickly turn into a harrowing ordeal filled with isolation, freezing temperatures, and intense hunger. In the spring of 1842, nearly 500 people set out from Independence, Missouri, aiming to follow a well-established trail to California. Among them was a group consisting of 32 members of the Reed and Donner families, traveling in 9 wagons. George Donner, the head of the family, had lived in various eastern states before deciding to make the journey west with his loved ones. Initially, the journey was relatively straightforward. The trail was busy with other travelers, and the warmer months made it manageable, despite the heat and exhaustion. But this ease would not last. It was crucial for the wagon train to cover as much ground as possible before winter, which would prove to be unforgiving. By September 18, 1842, an attempt to take a shortcut had led to disastrous results for the Donner Reed families. In their effort to reach California before the harsh winter, they managed to cross the Great Salt Lake Desert, but had slowed their progress by nearly a month. The desert's severe dryness and lack of water had pushed the group to the brink of despair, and many of their oxen and cattle had perished along the way. As tensions grew, the party began to splinter in October, with some wagons heading back east and others continuing westward. The remaining group became increasingly divided. During this time, 2 wagons got stuck together, and a man named John Snyder tried to resolve the situation. Lacking patience, Snyder began violently whipping one of the oxen. James Reed, the eldest and most respected member of the Reed family, stepped in to stop the abuse. This action enraged Snyder, who then turned the whip on Reed. A physical confrontation quickly escalated, with Reed drawing a long steel Bowie knife and fatally stabbing Snyder in the chest. Despite Reed's claim of self-defense, the group convened to decide his fate. United States laws were not applicable west of the Continental Divide in what was then Mexican territory, and wagon trains often dispensed their own justice. Some suggested that Reed should hang for his crimes, but it was eventually decided that he should merely be banished from the wagon train, but on pain of death should he attempt to return. What was once a happy adventure into the West had become a vicious fight for survival. Grass was becoming scarce and the animals were steadily weakening. To relieve the animals' load, everyone was expected to walk. The trials that the Donner Party had so far endured resulted in splintered groups, each looking out for themselves and distrustful of the others. In one incident of abject cruelty, an elderly man was ejected from the wagon he was reliant on for transport, being told that he had to walk or die. A few days later, the elderly man sat next to a stream, his feet so swollen they had split open. Some members of the party begged the others to wait for him, to show mercy to the party's weakest members, but the others refused, thinking only of themselves. The old man was not seen again. In the following weeks, attacks from the local Paiute Indian tribe were responsible for the party losing almost 40 of their cattle. This is extremely shocking for a number of reasons. Firstly, the Paiute tribe had first appeared friendly to the migrants, sharing supplies with them and even directing them onto trails that would take them westward. But at some point, the relationship had soured, and the people known for their respect and reverence of the natural world appeared to have no problem slaughtering the wagon train's animal accompaniment in an attempt to slow down or even stop the party dead in their tracks. With nearly all the cattle gone, one particular party member stopped to bury his wagon for safekeeping. 2 of his numbers stayed with him to help, but they returned without him, reporting they had been attacked by Paiutes, murdered and scalped. By the end of October, the party was forced to make camp around Truckee Lake in the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. 3 widely separated cabins of pine logs served as their homes, with dirt floors and poorly constructed flat roofs that leaked when it rained. Of the 60 at Truckee Lake, 19 were men over 18 years old, 12 were women, and 29 were children, 6 of whom were toddlers or younger. Very little food remained in their supplies, and the oxen began to die. Their carcasses were frozen and stacked. Truckee Lake was not yet iced over, but the pioneers were unfamiliar with catching lake trout. The most experienced hunter among them killed a bear, but had little luck after that. Margaret Reed promised to pay double when they got to California for the use of 3 oxen from other families. She was charged $25, normally the cost of 2 healthy oxen, for the carcass of a single ox that had starved to death. The mood in the camp was beyond tense. People were only looking out for themselves by this point, but an incoming blizzard would be the straw that broke the mule's back. During the height of the snowstorm, a man named Patrick Dolan began to rant deliriously, stripped off his clothes, and ran into the woods. He returned shortly afterwards and died a few hours later. Not long after, some of the group began to eat flesh from Dolan's body. The next morning, the group stripped the muscle and organs from Dolan's body, then dried them to store for the days ahead, taking care to ensure nobody would have to eat his or her relatives. As the days went by, more and more of the party succumbed to their desperate hunger and made the decision to consume human flesh. Some were determined to continue hunting and fishing, only turning to cannibalism when there was no other option. But it appeared some preferred the taste of human flesh and eschewed the long and tiring hunting trips in favor of consuming those who died of disease and malnutrition. At one point, a scouting party looking for the most efficient way ahead came across 2 Miwok Indians named Luis and Salvador. They had once been party members, but had attempted to move on when the supplies had run low. At the time they were discovered, they had not eaten anything for 9 whole days and were dangerously undernourished and weakened as a result. However, instead of attempting to rescue and save the lives of their Indian friends, one of the scouting parties simply shot them there and then before carving off chunks of their flesh with a hunting knife. On January 12th, the group stumbled into a Miwok camp looking so deteriorated that the camp's inhabitants initially fled, fearing them to be the spirits of undead souls who wandered the snow-capped mountain range. Once it was clear that they were in fact the survivors of a disastrous expedition, the Miwoks gave them what they had to eat: acorns, grass, and pine nuts, completely unaware that the group had murdered and eaten 2 starving members of their tribe. They were shaken, starving, and had arguably sold their souls to stay alive. But they were safe now, relatively safe anyway. Reporting on the event across the US was heavily influenced by the national enthusiasm for westward migration. In some papers, news of the tragedy was buried in small paragraphs despite the contemporary tendency to sensationalize stories. Several newspapers, including those in California, wrote about the cannibalism in graphic, exaggerated detail. In some print accounts, the members of the Donner Party were depicted as heroes and California a paradise worthy of significant sacrifices. But it seems that sacrificing one's family and friends, as well as losing one's humanity through consuming human flesh, might not be worth any prize, no matter how great. I've experienced sleep paralysis 3 times that I can remember. The first time was in 2018, right after I moved back to Australia from America. I was sleeping on an uncomfortable inflatable mattress. I woke up and found myself barely able to move, struggling just to sit up. My vision was mostly blacked out, but I could still see a little bit around me. I somehow managed to break out of it and was terrified. I had heard about sleep paralysis before and knew the kinds of horrifying experiences others had gone through because of it. I considered myself lucky to have escaped without anything worse happening. The second time occurred in 2020. I woke up in the morning and found myself completely paralyzed, unable to move a muscle. This time was much worse. I couldn't shake the thought that there better not be a shadow. I tried to scream, but all that came out was a low groan. Thankfully, I managed to snap out of it before things could escalate, or worse, before my fear of seeing a shadow person or some apparition came true. Then came the third and most traumatic encounter, which took place in 2021 during a particularly stressful period for me because of university exams. That might have played a role in triggering it, but who can say for sure? This instance was unlike the first 2. I clearly remember dreaming that I was in a strange house. The closest comparison I can think of is the house from the amazing world of Gumball. I know it's a strange connection, but that's the first thing that came to mind when I tried to picture the house. In the dream, I was walking towards some photos on the wall in what looked like a living room. They were pictures of my family, group shots and individual photos scattered across the walls. As I went through them, I noticed one photo that was unfamiliar. It was a portrait of a woman in her 30s, dressed in a white Victorian-style gown. She was all alone in the photo, staring directly at me, as if looking right into my soul. Upon seeing this, I was especially creeped out, so I turned my head to the left and stopped right in my tracks. There she was, the exact same woman from the photo, just standing in the living room of this house facing away from me. In my dream, I let out some sort of loud reaction, and all of a sudden her face snapped sideways where her eyes were meeting mine, at which point I awoke instantly. However, to my horror, I quickly discovered I was experiencing sleep paralysis yet again. This time, however, I looked slightly to my side to see the woman yet again, but actually standing on the other side of my room. Words cannot describe the level of pure fear and terror I experienced at that moment. As I began to try and scream and yell, the only noise that came out of my mouth yet again was some weird groan, not loud enough for anyone to hear. Things only escalated when the woman began to slowly approach my bed while slightly kneeling down to meet her face with mine, all while she had a finger over her mouth, smiling at the same time as if to hush me for my desperate attempts at screaming out for help, as well as mocking me for doing so. The terror of this was almost unbearable for me. I remember looking towards the roof of my room and seeing multiple white glowing apparitions moving in and out of my ceiling, all while this woman is constantly saying, "Shoo." Next thing I know, it was all gone. I could finally move again, and I had never been more grateful to fully wake up in my entire life. I don't know if anything from what I experienced had any deeper meaning. I seriously doubt it too. Since all this, I have never been able to identify the woman with anyone I know or anyone from my family that I never met but still have photos of. I hope I never need to give an update with a fourth experience of this horrible phenomenon. I'm a nurse, and a few years ago, I had to work a rotation in the burn unit around Thanksgiving. As you can imagine, burn victims tend to spike during certain times of the year. 4th of July is one, and Thanksgiving is another. Firework accidents can be pretty brutal, but they're nothing compared to what we see around Thanksgiving. It's also interesting how shooting and stabbing victims can sometimes be eerily calm. The adrenaline keeps them from feeling pain at first, and they're often surprisingly cooperative. But burn victims? That's a different story. The pain from second or third degree burns is beyond anything I can imagine, and it honestly makes me thankful I've never had to go through it myself. I've never had a patient look me in the eyes and beg me to end their suffering. Not until I worked the burn unit, that is. But none of that really sets the stage for how disturbing things can get in the burn unit. Let me get to the story. One night, we get two burn victims rushed into the ICU. A man and a woman, both in horrible condition, and they're accompanied by police officers who tell us the man is a pimp and the woman is, well, I'm not sure how to put it. Let's just call her his girl. Apparently, the man, the woman, and a few other women involved in his business were trying to have their own Thanksgiving dinner, with the woman in charge of cooking. I don't know what went wrong, but somehow, she ended up catching on fire. Instead of stopping, dropping, and rolling like we're all taught to do, she apparently decided to hug her pimp, the very same man who had set her on fire. A big, tight bear hug, and he caught fire too. At first, I heard this from another nurse, and no offense to her, but I didn't believe a word of it. But then, I overheard a cop talking to the consultant in charge, and he confirmed the story, saying that 3 witnesses from the scene all corroborated it. This was after they'd been separated. I guess the guy must have pushed her too far, and when he set her on fire, she must have thought, if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. I know this may sound unprofessional, but when I heard that the woman didn't make it, but the pimp survived, a thought crossed my mind. Asterisk God took the wrong person tonight. It was a real shame, but I don't think she stood a chance. Not only found out she had inhalation burns anyway. Once your lungs are extensively damaged from something like that, either from breathing in flame or toxic smoke, you're pretty much screwed. The pimp, on the other hand, added extremely serious burns to his front torso, face, and arms, but it looked like he was going to pull through. And so much so for natural justice, well, don't speak or think too soon because that weasel ended up suffering for what he did. Just not in the way you might think. Obviously, we had to keep the guy in for like a week afterward, all under police guard while being handcuffed to the bed. And the way he looked at me the one time I changed his bandages made my skin crawl. I wasn't there for this. I just heard about it, but one night, the night shift crew hears a bunch of screaming coming from the pimp's room. They initially thought he had some kind of intruder because one of my co-workers told me he was screaming stuff like, "Get away from me. Get away from me," as loud as he could. Knowing he was a criminal, they're about halfway ready to call the cops when they burst into his room and find no one there. Only the guy is still screaming, "Get out of here. She's gonna kill me. Get her off of me. Help." I remember interjecting and being like, "Nightmare." But she just shook her head, saying his eyes were wide open, and the whole time he was staring at this one spot in the wall right up until they finally got a doctor's order to sedate him. I'm not one to believe in spirits or ESP or any of that stuff. No offense to the people who do so, I'm not about to claim he was being haunted by the ghost of the girl he'd killed. Although that would be pretty sweet, not gonna lie. But saying that, I do think maybe a combo of the medication, not once by mouth, and the trauma of his injuries had him either flashing back or hallucinating that the girl was in the hospital room with him. Like I said, I didn't see any of that, nor do I believe that he was being haunted. But seeing how happy that guy was when he was discharged into police custody, that was honestly one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. I get the guy was in a bad way physically and mentally, but the hospital to jail transport switchover has a lot of people thinking they can escape. Not that guy. Not only does he not even try, he thanked the cop coming to get him like they were straight up saving him from something. And that's what had me questioning my sanity for a day or two, thinking, is there something else after we die? It's like Scatman Crothers says in The Shining. Maybe there's a lingering after something like that happens. Like the way the smell of burned toast lingers in the air for a while after you burn it. I know it's kind of in bad taste considering how he died, but maybe something of that poor girl stayed in the airway after she passed. Or maybe I'm just thinking too much into it. Either way, it was most definitely a Thanksgiving to remember, and one that made me ultra grateful to spend it with my family the following year. The first raindrop struck the tent with a faint patter, barely audible over the crackling of our dwindling campfire. I glanced at Jenny, her face cast in the glow of the flames, and saw my own anxiety mirrored in her eyes. Strange sounds had echoed through the woods all evening, but we'd brushed them off as typical forest noises. Now, as night enveloped us and the rain began to pour, those sounds took on a more menacing tone. We hadn't intended to camp so deep in the forest. The spot we'd originally planned to camp at, a popular site by the lake, had been overrun by loud teenagers when we arrived. Looking for a peaceful retreat, we'd ventured farther into the woods, eventually settling on a small clearing that seemed ideal. In hindsight, I should have known better. In every horror movie, it's always the couple who strays off the beaten path that ends up in danger. But this wasn't a movie. It was real life. And as I zipped the tent against the worsening rain, I tried to convince myself there was nothing to fear. We were experienced campers. We had all the supplies, a map, and a general idea of where the nearest ranger station was. We were fine. The rain picked up, rhythmically tapping against the tent. Jenny and I curled up in our sleeping bags, whispering about the hike we had planned for the next day. But as the night dragged on, our conversation petered out. Silence settled in, broken only by the sound of rain and the occasional far-off rumble of thunder. Around midnight, we heard it. A voice, low and indistinct, coming from somewhere in the dark beyond our tent. "Did you hear that?" Jenny whispered, her fingers gripping my arm. I nodded, straining to listen. For a moment, all was still, save for the rain. Then it came again. Another voice, different from the first, replying to something we couldn't make out. "Probably just other campers," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true. We hadn't seen any signs of other people all day, and these voices didn't sound like the typical chatter of campers. There was something urgent about them, something that made my skin crawl. Jenny sat up, pressing her ear against the tent wall. "They're getting closer," she whispered. She was right. The voices were clearer now, though still muffled by the rain. But it wasn't just voices anymore. There were footsteps too, moving through the underbrush with purpose. "We should see who it is," I said, reaching for the zipper of the tent. "Maybe someone's lost and needs help." Jenny grabbed my hand. "Are you crazy? We don't know who's out there." Before I could respond, a beam of light swept over our tent, illuminating our figures through the thin fabric. Jenny stifled a gasp, and we both froze, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps circled our tent slowly, deliberately. I could see shadows moving, hear low murmurs just on the other side of the nylon wall. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they must be able to hear it. "We know you're in there," a gruff voice called out suddenly, startlingly close. "Come on out. We just want to talk." Jenny and I exchanged terrified glances. The tone of the voice made it clear that talking was the last thing on their minds. "What do we do?" Jenny mouthed silently. I shook my head, at a loss. We were trapped. If we stayed in the tent, they could just rip it open. If we ran, we'd be at a disadvantage in the dark. Rainy woods. Another voice joined the first. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Come out now and nobody gets hurt." The lie was so blatant it almost made me laugh. Instead, I leaned close to Jenny's ear and whispered, "When I say go, run for the trees. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run." She nodded, her face pale but determined. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Then, in one swift motion, I unzipped the tent and yelled, "Go." We burst out of the tent like startled rabbits. I caught a glimpse of surprised faces, flashlight beams swinging wildly before I plunged into the darkness of the forest. I could hear Jenny crashing through the underbrush beside me, and behind us, shouts of anger and pounding footsteps. The rain lashed at my face as I ran, branches whipping past, unseen roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where we were going. All I knew was that we had to get away, had to lose our pursuers in the tangle of the forest. A gunshot cracked through the air, shockingly loud. Jenny screamed, and I reached out blindly, grabbing her hand and pulling her along. "Keep going," I gasped. We ran until my lungs were burning, until each breath felt like fire in my chest. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but I didn't dare stop. Not yet. Finally, when I felt like I couldn't take another step, I spotted a large fallen tree, its uprooted base creating a small sheltered space. I tugged Jenny towards it, and we crawled into the muddy hollow, trying to quiet our ragged breathing. For a long time, we just sat there, huddled together, listening. The rain continued to fall, but beyond that, the forest was quiet. No voices, no footsteps, just the steady drip of water from leaves and the occasional far-off rumble of thunder. "Do you think we lost them?" Jenny whispered eventually. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we can't stay here. We need to find help." As the adrenaline wore off, I became acutely aware of our situation. We were lost in the woods, in the middle of the night, in a rainstorm. We had no supplies, no phones, not even shoes. We'd fled the tent in our socks, which were now soaked through and muddy. And somewhere out there, unknown men with guns were looking for us. "We need to move," I said, peering out from our hiding spot. "Can you walk?" Jenny nodded, though I could see she was shivering. I wasn't much better off. We were both soaked to the skin, cold and terrified. But we couldn't stay here. We crawled out from under the fallen tree and stood, trying to get our bearings. The rain had let up a bit, but the clouds that might have helped us navigate. I tried to remember the direction we'd run from our campsite, thinking we should head the opposite way. "This way," I said, pointing. "I think there's a road a few miles in that direction. If we can reach it, we might be able to flag down a car." We set off, moving as quietly as we could through the wet undergrowth. Every snapping twig made us flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. More than once, we froze at the sound of movement nearby, only to realize it was just an animal or the wind in the trees. As we walked, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Who were those men? What did they want? The campsite had clearly been set as a trap. But for who? Was it us specifically, or just any unfortunate campers who happened to wander into it? The questions spun in my mind, unanswered and terrifying. All I knew for sure was that we had to keep moving. We had to find help before those men found us. The sky was just beginning to brighten with the first light of dawn when we finally heard the distant hum of traffic. That sound breathed new life into us, and we pushed on, ignoring the pain in our feet and the exhaustion in our bodies. We emerged from the trees onto the shoulder of a highway just as the sun began to rise. Seeing a passing car, the first sign of civilization we'd encountered in what felt like an eternity, nearly made me burst into tears from relief. We waved down the first vehicle that came by, an older couple in an RV who looked startled at our disheveled state. They called the police for us and offered us blankets and hot coffee as we waited. When the officers arrived, we recounted everything. At first, they seemed doubtful, but a search of the area where we'd camped uncovered evidence that backed up our story. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and, most damning of all, shell casings from a firearm. The officers told us we were lucky. There had been reports of a group targeting isolated campers, robbing them and sometimes doing worse. By running, we had likely saved our lives. In the days that followed, as we gave our statements and tried to piece our lives back together, I couldn't shake the realization of how close we had come to becoming just another statistic, another unexplained disappearance in the endless wilderness. We never camped again after that night. The forest, once a place of peace and adventure, now only held fear and bad memories. But sometimes, on rainy nights when the wind howls around the corners of our house, I find myself straining to listen. And in the stillness between the raindrops, I swear I can hear footsteps, circling, always circling, in the darkness just beyond the light. This happened years ago when I was around 8 or 9. My family and I lived in this huge, old, and oddly creepy house right on the edge of a small town in rural Pennsylvania. At the time, the local school districts were going through a big restructuring. Despite the fact that my little brother and I were only a couple of grades apart, we went to different schools and rode separate buses. This meant I was always the last person to leave the house in the mornings, but also the first to return in the afternoons since my school was much closer. But it also meant that I was the one responsible for making sure all the lights were off and the doors were locked before I left for school each day. One morning, I noticed that the basement light was on and the door was wide open. So, before I left, I made sure to turn off the light and lock the door behind me. Then, when I came home that afternoon, I saw that the light was back on and the door was open again. I remember feeling like I was losing my mind, wondering if I had imagined locking it that morning. I had been pretty tired, staying up late playing Overwatch, so it wasn't completely out of the question that I had just forgotten to do it. So, I went over to turn off the light and close the door, but as I reached the top of the basement stairs, I looked down and froze. There, standing at the bottom of the stairs, was a large shadowy figure. I freaked out. I slammed the door shut, shoved a cabinet in front of it, and ran upstairs to hide in my room. For months, I didn't tell my family because I was convinced that what I had seen was a ghost, and I didn't think anyone would believe me. It was around Halloween time, and I was young, impressionable, and had already developed a strong belief in the paranormal. Then, about 6 months after that creepy incident, my mom and dad started noticing things going missing around the house. At first, they blamed me and my brother. But after we both insisted that we weren't the ones taking things, we all walked around the house with flashlights, trying to figure out how anyone could have gotten inside without breaking in. It turned out that the thing I had seen in the basement wasn't a ghost at all. It was a real man. He had been climbing through a small hole on the outside of the house, crawling through a crawl space, and then coming up through the basement. The realization that I had been home alone with him on at least one occasion was one of the most terrifying things I've ever had to process. Needless to say, I don't believe in ghosts anymore. The highway stretched on forever, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the pitch-black night. I had been driving for hours, the endless monotony broken only by the occasional flash of my truck's headlights catching a road sign or the glint of a startled animal's eyes. I never imagined that picking up a stranger would turn my routine haul into a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened on that moonless night in the middle of nowhere. My name's Jack, and I've been a long-haul trucker for nearly 2 decades. I've seen my share of strange things on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. It was just past midnight, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Phoenix. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show about alien abductions. I laughed to myself, thinking about how some people would believe anything just to add excitement to their lives. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb out, hoping for a ride. I'm not usually the type to pick up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories, too many risks. But something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the late hour, or the fact that we were miles from anywhere, or maybe I was just tired of the solitude. I pulled over, the truck's air brakes hissing as it came to a stop. The man jogged up to the passenger side, and I leaned over to open the door. "Where are you headed?" I asked as he climbed in. "West," he said, his voice calm. "As far as you're going." I gave him a quick look as he settled into the seat. He was younger than me, probably in his early 30s. Lean, with short-cropped hair and eyes that seemed to take everything in at once. He had a small duffel bag, which he held tightly in his lap. "I'm Jack," I said, pulling back onto the highway. "Mike," he replied, not offering a handshake. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the rumble of the engine and the soft whisper of tires on asphalt. I tried to make conversation, asking him where he was from, what he did for a living. But Mike's answers were short, evasive. After a while, I gave up and focused on the road. It was about an hour later that I first noticed something was off. Mike had been fidgeting in his seat, constantly checking the side mirrors. At first, I thought maybe he was just nervous about hitching a ride with a stranger. But then I caught him glancing at me, a calculating look in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Fine," he said quickly, too quickly. "Just not used to being in a truck this big." I nodded, but I didn't believe him. My instincts, honed by years on the road, were screaming that something wasn't right. We were passing through a particularly desolate stretch of highway when Mike suddenly spoke up. "Pull over," he said, his voice tight. "What?" I said, "Pull over now." I glanced at him and felt my blood run cold. Mike had a gun in his hand, pointed straight at me. My mind raced. Was this a robbery? Was he going to kill me and take the truck? I thought about my wife back home, about our kids. Would I ever see them again? "Look, man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you want money, I've got some cash in my wallet. Just take it and go. No need for this to get ugly." Mike laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "This isn't about money, Jack. This is about survival. Now pull over before I decide to redecorate your cab with your brains." I did as he said, guiding the massive truck onto the shoulder. As soon as we came to a stop, Mike was in motion. He reached across me and grabbed the keys from the ignition. "Get out," he ordered, gesturing with the gun. I climbed out of the cab, my legs feeling like jelly. Mike followed, keeping the gun trained on me. "What do you want?" I asked, hating how my voice shook. "I need your truck," Mike said, "and I need you to drive it." "Drive it where?" "You'll know when we get there. Now get back in." "You're driving." As I climbed back into the driver's seat, my mind was working overtime. I needed to find a way out of this situation. Maybe if I could distract him, I could make a grab for the gun, or maybe I could intentionally drive badly, try to attract the attention of a highway patrol car. But as if reading my thoughts, Mike spoke up. "Don't try anything stupid, Jack. I've got nothing to lose, which means you've got everything to lose. Just drive normally and do what I say." So I drove. Hours passed, the landscape outside changing as we headed west. All the while, Mike kept the gun trained on me, his eyes constantly scanning the road behind us. "Who are you running from?" I finally asked, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. Mike was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. "Then bad people," he said softly. "People who want me dead." "Why?" He laughed again, that same humorless sound. "Because I know things. Things they don't want anyone to know." My mind raced with possibilities. Was he some kind of whistleblower? A witness to a crime? Whatever it was, I was now involved, whether I wanted to be or not. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Mike suddenly tensed. "Shit," he muttered, staring intently at the side mirror. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a black SUV gaining on us fast. "Drive faster," Mike ordered, his knuckles white around the gun. I pressed down on the accelerator, the engine roaring as we picked up speed. But the SUV was faster, sleeker. It pulled alongside us, and I saw the passenger window rolling down. "Get down," Mike yelled, just as the sound of gunfire erupted. I ducked instinctively, feeling the truck swerve as bullets pinged off the metal. Mike was returning fire, leaning out the window to shoot at our pursuers. The next few minutes were chaos. I struggled to keep the truck on the road while trying to stay low. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the confined space of the cab. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the truck lurched violently. They had shot out one of our tires. I fought with the steering wheel, trying to keep us from jackknifing. "There," Mike shouted, pointing ahead. "Pull into that rest stop." I saw the sign for the upcoming rest area and made for it, the truck swaying dangerously on its blown tire. We skidded into the parking lot, coming to a stop in a cloud of dust and burning rubber. "Run," Mike yelled, already jumping out of the cab. I didn't need to be told twice. I was out of the truck and running before I even had time to think. I could hear car doors slamming behind us, shouts of anger. Mike and I ran towards the small cluster of buildings that made up the rest stop. It was early, and the place was deserted. We burst into the main building, startling a sleepy-looking attendant. "Call the police," I gasped out. "Are there men with guns?" But before I could finish, the door burst open again. 3 men entered, all holding weapons. The attendant screamed and ducked behind the counter. Mike shoved me behind a rack of snacks and opened fire. The men returned fire, and suddenly the quiet rest stop was transformed into a war zone. Chips bags exploded, sending a rain of potato shards everywhere. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. I crouched behind the rack, my heart thudding so hard it felt like it might explode. This was madness. How had a normal night turned into this? The gunfire seemed to stretch on forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. I peeked around the edge of the rack. Mike was still standing, gun raised, while the 3 men lay motionless on the floor. A wave of nausea hit me, and I had to swallow hard to keep from vomiting. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching. Someone, likely the attendant, had managed to call the police. Mike turned to me, his expression dark. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Before I could say anything, he was gone, dashing out the back door of the rest stop. I thought about chasing after him, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I just sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of the shootout, waiting for the police to arrive. The aftermath was a blur of statements and questions. I told them everything about picking up Mike, the chase, and the shootout. They were skeptical at first, but the evidence supported my story. It turned out Mike was a whistleblower, planning to testify against a major crime syndicate. The men after us were hitmen sent to silence him. Mike was never found, disappearing into the desert. As for me, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. But it changed me. I still drive my routes, still haul loads across the country. But now, I'm more cautious, more aware of the darkness that can hide behind a friendly face. And I never pick up hitchhikers anymore. I was 29 when this happened, back in 2020. My friend, Stacy, told me about her friend, Brianne, who needed a dog sitter because she and her husband were going on vacation to California. Stacy knew I dog sat through an app called Rover, which lets you house sit dogs for strangers, walk them, and do various pet-related tasks. Since I was in need of some extra cash, I thought it would be a great opportunity. $200 for 5 days of dog sitting? Why not? A week before I started, Brianne gave me a tour of her house and introduced me to her massive husky, Bear. He was a bit overweight but still adorable. She told me I could help myself to any food I wanted. The front door had a secure code lock, so I felt safe. The first couple of days went by smoothly. I worked during the day, fed Bear on my breaks, took him on rides in my car at night, and stayed up late watching movies. Bear would sleep by my side when it was time for bed. Everything was normal until Monday night after work, when I heard a knock at the door. I looked through the peephole and saw a man in what looked like a black police uniform. It struck me as odd, but I opened the door to see what he wanted. "Hello, I'm looking for a George," he said. "George?" I thought for a second. "Oh no, there's no George here. I'm dog sitting for a friend. I've been here since Friday," I added, and looking back, it was probably a mistake to tell a random person I was alone. "Oh, okay. How long are you here?" he asked. "Till Wednesday," I replied. "Okay, cool. Sorry to bother you," he said and left. I was a bit weirded out, so I locked the door and texted Brianne about what happened. She brushed it off, telling me not to worry. The next few days were uneventful, but when I went to bed on Wednesday night, I had an odd feeling that I should double-check the front door. I got up and checked. It was locked, but I still felt uneasy. Around 3:05 a.m., I woke up to Bear barking like crazy. It freaked me out because I thought someone had broken in. I got up and went into the living room to find Bear growling and barking at the front door. I peeked through the peephole and saw the same man, this time with another guy in a security guard uniform. At that point, I was really creeped out. Why would the same guy come back when he knew I was alone? I didn't open the door this time. 2 strangers dressed like security guards at 3 a.m.? No way. I made sure all the doors were locked. When they finally walked away, I opened the door but didn't see any security vehicle. I still think bears barking may have scared them off. I went back inside, locked up, and went back to bed. I didn't tell Brienne about it since she was in California. I stayed one more night after that, but I was so relieved to leave. To this day, I have no idea who those guys were or what they wanted, and I haven't been back to dog sit since. This happened last night around 11:30 p.m., when everyone in the house had already gone to bed. It's just me, my mom, and my brother living here now, since my dad is staying at our second home a few minutes away. He still works and doesn't want to risk exposing us to COVID-19, so he's been staying there. I'm a 21-year-old girl home from college, staying in my childhood bedroom on the second floor. My window is directly above where my dad keeps trash cans to collect rainwater in the backyard. It hasn't rained recently, so the trash cans are empty, but there are still 3 cans right under my window. The house was dark except for my bedside lamp. I was in bed texting some friends when I heard a faint screech coming from outside my window. I stopped, immediately turned off my lamp, and listened carefully, trying to figure out whether it was a cat or maybe a child. But after a few moments, I didn't hear anything else, so I assumed it was just my imagination. However, I was still on edge because I'd never heard a sound like that before. I kept my lamp off since I don't have curtains, just vertical shutters, and light tends to bleed through. A few minutes passed, and then I heard another noise, this time a child's laughter. I froze because I've read stories about people using tapes of babies crying to lure unsuspecting victims, and I never thought it would happen to me. I know that my neighbors on both sides have young children, so I thought maybe one of them had somehow gotten out of their house. My window faces the neighbor to the right, and our houses are close together. They have a toddler and a big pit bull that spends some nights outside in their backyard. There's only about 10 feet between our houses, and we share a fence. I cautiously got out of bed and walked over to my window. I only opened the shutters a crack, not wanting to be seen if someone was outside. I didn't see anything, but the laughter was clearer now, and it definitely sounded like a child's laugh. It was close. I opened the shutters all the way, trying to see who was making the noise. By this point, it was almost midnight, but I couldn't see anyone. I kept hearing the laughter, though. I tried to look into my neighbor's yard, but still, I couldn't see anything, and their dog didn't seem to be outside. I was really creeped out by this point, so I went back to bed, hoping to get some sleep. I'd been lying there for about 5 minutes when I heard another noise outside my window. I don't know how to describe it, but my skin was crawling as I'm typing this. First, I heard a thud, followed by the sound of something moving, like someone was messing with the trash cans directly under my window. I tried to convince myself it was probably the neighbor's dog, but I knew that couldn't be it. Whenever their dog is outside, he barks, and I hadn't seen him earlier. A few moments passed, and I was starting to relax again when I heard a knock, or maybe a clunk, on my window. I immediately got up again. I was terrified, unable to move, and I prayed that I had just imagined those noises. But then, a louder clunk echoed, and I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of my room to my mom and told her everything that had happened. My mom immediately turned on all the lights and came to my room to look out the window with me, but there was no one in sight. She checked that all the doors were locked, and then she told me to sleep with her that night for comfort. So, I moved all my blankets and pillows into her room, and I ended up sleeping there. The next morning, when I woke up, I had almost forgotten about everything that happened the night before. I was in my room getting dressed when I noticed something in the reflection on the carpet beneath my windowsill. I went over to investigate and realized quickly that it was glass. I had a few picture frames by the window, so I assumed one of them must have fallen when my mom and I looked out the window last night. I checked each picture frame to see which one might have been knocked down. I scanned them once, then again to make sure I hadn't missed any. But all the frames were intact, and everything seemed in place. Then, I reached for my shutters and slowly pulled them open. More glass pieces fell to the floor at my feet, and a sickening feeling washed over me. My window was partially broken. I screamed, and my mom rushed to my room. I showed her the broken window, and she asked how this could have happened. especially since the window hadn't been broken when we looked out the night before. There was nothing in the backyard that could have caused it. My room is on the side of the house on the second floor, and there are no trees on that side of the house. There are no trees on my neighbor's side yard either. There were also no dead animals or blood, which would have suggested that something, an animal perhaps, crashed into the window. We don't have a security system or cameras, and my dad can't even stay the night with us right now. I don't want to be afraid to sleep in my own room, but at this point, I just don't want to be in there at all. I never planned on finding the tunnel. I had been hiking the same wooded trail for years, following its winding path along the edge of a forgotten ravine. It was peaceful, untouched, a place where time felt slower, but that changed when the storm rolled in. I had underestimated the weather. One moment, the sky was clear. The next, thick clouds had swallowed the sun, and rain poured in heavy sheets. I hurried to find shelter, slipping down a muddy incline. That's when I saw it. A doorway, barely visible through the thick tangle of undergrowth, carved into the side of the ravine. It didn't belong there. The structure was old, older than the trees that surrounded it. Moss and vines had overtaken its stone archway, the entrance framed in crumbling brick. Faded, rusted metal jutted out where a door might have once stood. I hesitated at the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond. The tunnel stretched forward, an unbroken void, swallowing the dim light of the stormy sky. Something about it made my skin crawl. I should have turned back. I should have ignored it, but I didn't. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was thick, damp, carrying a scent of decay. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the tunnel's smooth, stone walls. I pulled out my phone, the flashlight flickering weakly in the blackness ahead. The tunnel sloped downward, deeper into the earth. The further I walked, the colder it became. The walls bore strange carvings, symbols that looked both ancient and hastily etched, their meaning lost to time. I traced one with my fingers, the grooves oddly deep, as if made by something with claws rather than tools. That's when I heard it, a shuffling sound, far ahead. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. The sound wasn't distant wind or dripping water. It was movement. Something was in the tunnel with me. I turned back, my pulse hammering. I had only taken a few steps inside. I could still make it out quickly. But when I turned, my stomach dropped. The entrance was gone. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, the dim light of the outside world erased as if it had never existed. My phone's flashlight flickered again, the shadows closing in around me. Then, another sound, closer this time, a scraping like nails dragging against stone. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged, my fingers shaking as I swept my light along the walls. The symbols were changing. They were moving, figures twisted, their limbs stretching, mouths widening into hollow, empty voids. I blinked hard, willing the illusion away, but when I opened my eyes, I was no longer alone. A shape emerged from the blackness, tall, twisted. It moved unnaturally, its joints bending wrong, its head lolling as if too heavy for its body. My flashlight illuminated the gaping hole where its face should have been. Then it spoke, or rather, it whispered, "You were not meant to find this place." The words slithered through the tunnel, echoing off the walls, sinking into my bones. My legs finally obeyed. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I sprinted into the darkness, praying that the tunnel would lead somewhere, anywhere, other than the nightmare I had stumbled into. Finally, after what felt like miles, I saw light, a pinprick in the distance, growing, stretching, until I burst from the tunnel into the cold night air. I collapsed onto the damp earth, gasping, the storm long past. But the tunnel was gone. I searched for it the next day for hours, but the ravine was just that, a ravine. No doorway, no tunnel, no proof that it had ever been there. I tell myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the whisper. You were not meant to find this place. And I know, deep down, that it's waiting for me to return.
The nightmare started soon after.
Each night, I found myself back in the tunnel, my feet sinking into the damp earth as I walked forward. The carvings on the walls pulsed like breathing flesh, the symbols shifting and rearranging themselves before my eyes. And ahead, always ahead, the whispering grew louder. You should not be here. I tried to wake myself up, to force my body to move, to run. But in the dream, I never had control. The tunnel stretched endlessly, shifting and changing, the walls closing in, narrowing until I could barely move. And just before I woke, I always saw it. That thing, the faceless, broken figure standing in the distance, waiting. One night, I woke up to find dirt on my sheets. Damp, muddy footprints trailed across my bedroom floor. My hiking boots, still caked with soil, were lying by the door. I hadn't worn them in days. I left town the next morning, packed whatever I could into my car and drove, not caring where I ended up as long as it was far from the woods. But no matter where I went, the dreams followed. The whispers grew louder. Then the call started. Unknown number. No one on the line. Just the sound of something breathing, slow and ragged. Last night, I woke up to knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at my apartment door. I checked the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Then, just before dawn, a final message appeared on my phone. Come back. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I don't know if I even have a choice anymore. But I do know one thing. The tunnel is still waiting. I could share countless stories from the house where I grew up. We moved to Lawrenceville, Georgia when I was 8, and I lived there for about 5 years between 2000 and 2003. Sounds cliche to say the house felt off, but it really did. At the time, I had nothing to compare it to, so I couldn't fully understand why it felt strange. I had a vivid imagination, and I loved horror movies, so it was easy to convince myself that everything was just in my head. But looking back, there's no place I've ever lived that could make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up like certain rooms in that house. I remember leaping across the doorway to the bathroom because I was convinced someone would be waiting for me if I didn't. I would always close my sister's bedroom door, even after she moved out, because the room never really felt empty. And the basement? No one went down there alone, especially after what happened a couple of months after we moved in. It was a hot summer day when our parents were at work, and it was just my sister and me at home. I was playing Sly Cooper on the PS2 when my sister suddenly barged into my room, holding our dog, and grabbed my baseball bat. She looked at me with urgency and said, "We need to get out of the house." Her eyes made it clear that she wasn't joking. Our neighbors, who had been friends with our parents and were former cops from New York, lived down the road, and we were always told to go to their house if anything ever happened. We walked to their house, and my sister told them that someone was in our house. But as we got further from the house, I could tell there was doubt creeping into her mind about what had just occurred. Our ex-cop neighbor must have sensed her uncertainty, because instead of calling the police, he decided to check the house himself. He didn't find anything. When he returned, he asked her what had happened, and this was her story. She told him that our small dog, Max, had been standing at the top of the basement stairs, barking into the dark with his tail between his legs. It was unusual for him to behave like that, so she followed him downstairs to see what was wrong. When she reached the bottom, Max was peering around the corner, looking toward the storage room, whimpering. My sister picked him up and peeked around the corner to see what had him so agitated. And to this day, she swears she saw a man standing in the dark corner a few feet in front of her, grinning. He raised a finger to his lips and whispered, I had just moved to Rhode Island and was still getting settled when I met this guy named Joe. He asked me out to dinner, and we quickly started spending a lot of time together, eventually becoming a couple. A few weeks into our relationship, Joe decided to invite his friends, Jay and Paul, over for dinner. I cooked, and everything went smoothly. We actually got along really well. Before long, the evening turned into us sitting on the floor of the apartment, chatting about politics. It was a good time. Jay had some vision problems and couldn't drive, so after Paul left, Joe agreed to drive Jay home. During the drive, Jay started yelling at Joe, venting about how he never gets his way and how Joe always seemed to have everything going for him. Especially me, calling me everything he ever wanted in a girl. While I was flattered, the outburst was a little unsettling. Jay then demanded that Joe pull over so he could walk home. Joe, not wanting to leave Jay, who had limited vision, in an unfamiliar town at 1 a.m., tried to keep him in the car, but Jay opened the door while the car was moving and tried to get out. Joe eventually had to pull over and let him go. Joe came back to the apartment and told me everything that had happened, and I felt terrible knowing that Jay was wandering the city at that hour. Jay had already texted Joe, telling him to leave him alone. So, I drove out to find him, and sure enough, he was only about 20 feet from where Joe had left him. I made him get in the car and took him home. The next day, Joe tried to talk to Jay about what had happened, but it ended in an argument. A couple of weeks later, Jay called me out of the blue, and I have no idea how he got my number. Joe said he hadn't given it to him. He apologized for his behavior. The conversation started out fine, but then it got strange. Jay began telling me how much he needed someone like me and how much he liked me, even from the first moment we met. He then went on to speak badly about Joe, who he'd been friends with for over 25 years, ever since they met at a camp for kids with eye problems. Jay talked about all the women Joe had been with and how he was bad for me, suggesting I deserved someone like him instead. I told him I was uncomfortable and ended the call. Later that evening, Joe came over and we discussed the phone call. He was understandably upset, and I tried to reassure him, thinking Jay was just lonely, so we brushed it off. A few days later, Jay and Joe patched things up, but there was still some tension. They went out for lunch, and I received a text from Joe asking me to meet him at a restaurant. When I got there, I found out that Joe hadn't actually sent the message. It was Jay who had taken his phone and messaged me. It was awkward and led to yet another argument. I went home feeling upset, not liking to see two longtime friends fighting like this, especially with the hurtful things they were saying to each other. Joe was very defensive of me, and Jay was just being cruel. So Joe came over later that night to see how I was, and we watched a movie to relax. He left later that evening, and after about 10 to 15 minutes after he left, I got a phone call from an unknown number. It was Jay, and he said it was an emergency and that he was at the hospital and that Joe wasn't answering his phone. So I got dressed and got in the car and headed to the hospital. You see, Jay has a form of eye cancer, retinoblastoma, so I thought something might be wrong. On the way there, I called Joe and left him a voicemail telling him what was up. I get to the hospital and no one with Jay's name was checked in. I called his cell, but there was no answer. So I drove home, and when I got to my house, Jay was on my front steps. I hadn't seen him until I got to the front steps, as I have a very long and dark driveway. I asked him what the hell was going on. I was super scared and nervous at the same time, and he started telling me how much he loved me and wanted me, and that Joe didn't deserve me, and that if I would just be with him, he would be so happy, as would I. He was getting closer and closer to me with every sentence, and I was backing up further and further. It was very scary, and I started to yell at him to stop and leave, or I would call the police, and he wasn't listening. So I felt into my jean pocket for my phone, and I had left it in the car. So I turned and started running for my car, and I could hear him right behind me. I made it to my car and managed to unlock it and get in before he caught up. I was just punching in 911 when Joe pulled up into the driveway behind me. He had Paul with him. I guess they went to the hospital to see Jay. They both got out and went to Jay to calm him down. They finally got him to leave, and Joe was so apologetic, and Bull had no idea what was happening because he didn't know any of the other details. They went inside to calm me down and so that Joe could catch up Paul on the story. They both stayed the night there, and Joe and Paul contacted Jay and informed him that if he were ever to come near me again, the police would be contacted and there would be a restraining order placed on him. So fast forward a few months. It's now New Year's Eve, and the three of us had not seen or heard from Jay, and we were moving on from the whole situation. So Joe is having a New Year's Eve party at his apartment, and we were all having a great time and enjoying the evening. At around 11:30, the doorbell rang and I went to answer. And guess who was at the door? With Joe's ex-girlfriend, Sarah. I lost it a bit and almost slammed the door shut in their face. Joe showed up behind me and was trying to figure out what was going on exactly. Turns out Jay had been contacting Sarah for the past 3 months, trying to hook her back up with Joe, and he was scaring her immensely, doing to her what he did to me with the phone calls, the harassment, and telling her how much he loved her. Tonight, however, she had enough of his crap and told him to meet her at Joe's house. We told the cops that she didn't want him near her and to contact her for her statement. I felt bad about it, but I left my statement as well, and we all ended up with a restraining order. I work as a receptionist at a local hotel, and most of my shifts are overnight. I handle the front desk, which includes checking in guests, answering calls, and monitoring the security cameras. The job is usually pretty uneventful, as our hotel isn't very large or busy. On this particular night, the place was almost empty, with only a handful of guests. I was sitting at the desk, scrolling through my phone, when I saw a man approaching the doors. I stood up to greet him as he entered. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I need a room for the night." He was definitely intoxicated or under some kind of influence, but I checked him in anyway and gave him a key. Since the hotel wasn't even 75% full, it was standard practice to accommodate walk-ins. He made his way toward the elevators, and I sat back down, resuming my phone scrolling. Hours passed, and I was still sitting at the front desk when I heard a noise from the hallway. It sounded like a thump, almost as if a door was being forced open. I stood up and walked toward the sound. It was the man I had checked in earlier, now trying to get into one of our maintenance closets. "Can I help you with something?" I asked. He gave me a quick glance with those unsettling eyes but didn't say anything. I asked again, but he just stared, silent. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe he was just really high and looking for the vending machine or something, not wanting to escalate things. I went back to my desk and tried to push it out of my mind. A while passed without any more noise, no one walking through the halls, and no guests entering. Around 3 a.m., I decided to walk around the first floor to stay awake. As I neared the hallway near the front desk, I heard a loud bang from one of the rooms. I froze for a moment, listening intently, then decided to check the second floor where I thought the noise came from. It was eerily quiet now, and that made me feel uneasy. I walked down the hall, hearing nothing. At the end, one of the doors was slightly open. I paused, listened once more, and gently knocked. No response. I carefully peered inside, unsure of what I might find. The room looked empty. I didn't feel comfortable entering further, so I couldn't inspect thoroughly, but I was fairly certain no one was inside. I shut the door and glanced at the room number, 112. That was the same room I'd given the man. I never saw him leave the building, though. I hurried back to the front desk and checked the security cameras, but he never showed up on any of the feeds. Just then, the hotel phone rang. I jumped. One of the rooms was calling. I picked it up. "Hello? How can I assist you?" A woman's voice came through, telling me a man had been knocking on her door in the middle of the night. I apologized and reassured her I'd take care of it. After hanging up, I took a deep breath, feeling my nerves starting to kick in. I got up from the desk, but before I could go anywhere, the phone rang again. This time, it was another guest in a different room saying the same thing. Someone had been knocking at his door in the dead of night. I called the police immediately and stayed by the front doors, just in case I needed to make a quick getaway. Fortunately, they arrived before anything serious happened. However, they didn't find the man. Instead, they discovered a broken window in his room, which he likely jumped out of. It was on the second floor, so I have no idea how he managed to escape without serious injury. While the police continued searching, they received a report that the car the man used to pay for the room had been stolen. What the man intended or why he was knocking on doors is still a mystery. I'm relieved none of the guests opened their doors, as things could have turned out much worse if they had. This happened to me about a year ago, maybe 2 at most. A friend of mine named Tate had recently moved, and I went up one weekend to visit him. Tate and we usually spent our time gaming, watching movies, the usual stuff, but we also enjoyed going outside and exploring. Back in his old neighborhood, there was this creek we used to explore for hours. So, the next morning, I asked him if there was anything like that near his new place that we could check out. To my excitement, there actually was. About a mile or so from his house, there was a 7-Eleven, and next to it was this massive field that led into the woods. We grabbed some drinks, and once the traffic calmed down, we crossed the street to the field. At first, I was kind of disappointed because it wasn't anything like the creek, and it seemed pretty dull. But once we reached the end of the field, where the woods began, things started to get more interesting. We climbed down and entered the woods. At first, there was nothing too unusual. I saw a fox darting through the trees and disappearing in the opposite direction of where we were headed, but that was about it. However, these woods themselves had a strange vibe. Nothing big, just little oddities. There were styrofoam coolers scattered on the ground, broken lawn chairs, a tire, shattered glass, and even a white tank top tied to a tree. It was all just weird. We joked around, saying people probably came down here to drink, or maybe someone had crashed their car and now lived out here. Eventually, we wandered deeper into the woods, and off to the right, I noticed a house. It wasn't in the woods, but we could see it from where we were, and honestly, it looked like it was falling apart. The house was old, run down, and there was a long ladder leaning against the roof. On the ladder stood a man wearing a reflective orange vest and a baseball cap, so we couldn't really see his face clearly. He wasn't too close, so we didn't worry much about it. But he saw us and stared at us for what felt like a long time. We kept walking. We made our way to what felt like the end of the woods, where a fence separated the trees from the streets and cars. My friend had to pee, so we stopped for a moment. After about 30 seconds, we decided it was time to head back to his house. I was a little disappointed, to be honest, because the creek at his old place was way more fun, and I really liked being near the water. We were walking and chatting when suddenly, we heard some leaves crunching behind us. We turned around, and there was the man from the ladder standing there. We didn't say a word, and he just stared at us. He wasn't close, but I had a bad gut feeling, and we turned around and started walking quickly towards the field. We hear twigs break and leaves crunch behind us, and I turn my head as I'm walking, and it was the man again. He was definitely following us and wasn't saying a single word. Both times when I turned around and saw him, he didn't walk too. He just kind of stood there and looked at us. At this point, we're basically sprinting, and we run up the incline to get back onto the field and out of those woods. After we got out of the field and saw cars and the 7-Eleven, we both felt relieved and we stopped. I turned around to face the woods, and he was there again, right at the end of the woods, just staring at us. He didn't climb out and get onto the field, and again, he didn't communicate a single word. He just stood there staring at us. I took a blurry Snapchat video on my phone, and I thought I saved it, but I can't find it, or else I try to upload it. I'm not sure if I can hear anyway, but it was far and zoomed in, and all I could capture was his blurry face and baseball cap. To this day, I think about that day at the woods. Tate is a couple of years younger than me, and I'm big, but I'm not that strong, and this was a grown man. He definitely could have tried something if he wanted to. For the life of me, I can't figure out what his intentions were and what the hell he was doing in that forest. If he was just trying to scare us, or if he would have actually hurt us or done something perverse if we didn't start running. Instead, all he did was stare at us, but man, was it creepy. I'm not sure where to even start. I guess I'll begin by saying that I always watched Ghost Hunters and laughed at how fake everything seemed. That was before I moved to college. I started college in February 2012 at a small southern school in Milledgeville, Georgia. It was just like you'd expect. Cool people, fun times, and an overall amazing experience. One night, while my friends and I were up playing Pong at 4 or 5 in the morning, I overheard them talking about a place a few blocks away that was supposedly haunted beyond belief. It was called Central State Hospital. Here's a little history on it. Central State was a former asylum that dealt with everything from lobotomies to just about anything you can imagine. The hospital sat on nearly 2,000 acres of land, and over 20,000 bodies are buried there, all of them unidentified. People from all over the country who were mentally unstable or insane were sent there, and many of them died there. A trip to check it out was planned, and a few nights later, my roommate, Andre, and I made our way to Central State. We drove around, dicking around like typical 18-year-old college freshmen. We cruised around the grounds, looking at the creepy buildings that seemed frozen in time. We spent a couple of hours doing this until about 2 a.m., at which point we figured we'd seen enough and headed back. A few nights later, two other friends of mine, Alan and Eric, asked about the trip and wanted to check it out for themselves. Since I felt like I knew the place well enough from the first trip, I decided to give them the grand tour. Eric had to work that night, so it was just Alan and me. We headed back to the grounds. When we got there, we did the usual, looking at the creepy buildings, and of course we had the typical oohs and HS. Late into the night, around 3 a.m., we were heading out when we passed a cul-de-sac full of old, abandoned houses that were falling apart. Alan was in the passenger seat, and I was driving. Looking out of our windows, the cul-de-sac was on my side of the car. I noticed a streetlight at the far end, but in between the road and the cul-de-sac, it was pretty dark, making it hard to see. As I drove slowly through, I saw a dark outline in the middle of the road, blocking the light from the streetlight behind it. At first, I didn't think much of it and figured it could be a bush or something. I mentioned it to Alan, but he said he didn't see anything. He asked if I could loop around so he could get a better look. So, I made a loop around the cul-de-sac, and we both stared out at the spot where I had seen the outline. I looked at it again, but this time, there was nothing there. Thinking it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, I looked back at the road ahead and kept driving. Alan is one of the calmest people I've ever met, so when he suddenly yelled, I knew something was wrong. I immediately gunned the throttle, speeding down the road. I shouted back, "What was it?" Alan responded, "I don't know." Then I saw it too. The black outline had returned, and this time, it made a mad dash toward the car. Needless to say, we were both terrified. We didn't want to get out of the car. It was 3 a.m, everyone else was asleep, and it was a good half-mile walk from where we parked to our apartment. We were both shaken up, and neither of us had any intention of sticking around to find out what it was. So we decided to do what any like-minded person would do. We drove around until 4 a.m. trying to calm our nerves. We were slowly coming back to a normal heart rate when we saw a homeless-looking person under a street light in the road ahead of us. We slowed down. Homelessness is a normal thing around this town, but as we passed, something was wrong. The homeless man's eyes were blue. This man was a black African American. When I say blue, I don't mean the pretty boy model blue, but the blue like he was blind, the blue icy eyes that come from some kind of horror movie. As we slowly drove past him, he lifted his hand and pointed straight at us while mumbling some kind of chant. Needless to say, we were ready to shit ourselves. I'd like to say that that's where the story ended, but that was just the beginning. We ended up finally getting back into the dorms around 4:30 a.m., and we were both very tired and freaked out, so we just decided to try and call it a night. A few weeks went on and nothing weird happened. It was just like how the semester started. Cool people hanging out all the time and having a lot of fun. Then things started happening in Eric and Alan's room mainly. They were 1 floor above and a few rooms over from Andre and I. We constantly hung out in Alan and Eric's room, though, so we noticed things in different positions, small things at first, like pieces of paper and things in the bathroom. We thought it was just people or the air conditioning moving it, but we finally got tired of all the confusion and we did what we thought would be the best possible thing. We rented out a little shitty video camera from the school library and set it up in Alan and Eric's bathroom one night when we left for dinner one night. On a side note, we also put some ping pong balls, they're the only thing we could find at the time, in front of the camera and closed and locked all the doors and turned off the air conditioning so there was no airflow. So we left not thinking much of it. We went and ate dinner, and Eric had to come back early and then head to the library to go study for tests. Alan and I found our way back to his dorm room and picked up the camera and noticed all the ping pong balls were in Eric's room by his bed. We assumed he got there early and moved them before we left. We finally got around to checking the video a few days later and was startled by what was on it. The entire video was full of voices and footsteps stomping around the camera. Then the craziest thing happened. Halfway through the video, the balls rolled from the bathroom into Eric's room without anything touching them. Right when we reached this point in the video, Alan and I could hear Eric's dresser doors loudly opening and closing. Not realizing he was back already, I ran into his room about to tell him you needed to come and see this. I walked in his room, opened his door, and was welcomed by darkness. Nobody was in his room and nobody had been in this room for hours. I walk back to Alan's room and tell him, and we both just decide to drop this. We were going to stop thinking about and giving any attention to whatever the fuck was bothering us. So a few weeks went on and nothing really happened. We went home for the Christmas break, thinking everything had cleared, and we came back to a new semester without the pests that had been with us. We came back and everything was great for a while, just normal school again. One night, Alan, Eric, Andre, and I were watching scary movies on Netflix, bored out of our minds, and we started talking about that crazy shit that happened the semester before. We shouldn't have done that. The next day, Alan and I walked into his room and just feel something very wrong. You ever get that feeling somebody is right behind you just staring at you? Yeah. Felt like that. Things started happening again. One night near the end of the second semester, Alan and I had went and picked up some dinner and were walking back into his room. We could hear the radio absolutely blaring in Eric's room. I said, well, I guess Eric is having a party tonight or something along those lines. We opened Alan's door and noticed something really, really weird about the radio in Eric's room. It wasn't playing music. It was playing a baseball game broadcast. And not just any broadcast, it sounded like something from the blaring through the entire dorm. I go to walk into Eric's room asking him what the hell he's doing, and right as I turn to go in, the radio stops. It doesn't turn down, it just flat stops. I looked around and nobody was in the room, of course. Alan and I both said, "What the fuck?" and walked out. I refused to really go back into their rooms anymore after that, and again, I would love to say that that's where it all ended, but it's not. The next year, Andre and I lived together again, and we were assigned rooms. On move-in day, we find each other and greet each other in the typical ways, but then we head to find our rooms, and we find them. We are in the rooms located directly under Eric and Alan's room from the year before. Fuck, we expect the worst, but try and keep our mind off the thing, whatever it was. We go on an entire semester and nothing happened. It was sophomore year of college. For us, it was filled of Netflix, Xbox, working on our cars, and class. Nothing crazy. The spring semester starts, and early into the semester, we have a massive snowstorm come through. Eric ends up losing power at his place, and him and his girlfriend come by to stay the night. So we play Netflix for a while until the lights start blinking, and it happens. We lose power. Luckily, we had a few candles and lit them throughout the room and the bathroom and decided to play some card games. We probably played for a good 2 hours or so. Yes, we were pretty competitive. We play, and eventually we get tired of it and just sit and talk. Eventually, the subject of last year comes up. Eric asks if we have had anything like that happen to us this year. In that moment, that very moment of him asking, after nothing happening for an entire semester, it came back. In the middle of him asking about it, we heard a loud cling from the bathroom. It sounded like glass hitting something. Everyone was in the same room, so there was no way it was one of us. Came from the bathroom. Andre gets up and walks into the bathroom very slowly just to look around. He looks on the bathroom counter and next to the one candle we had lit, laid a spoon. Andre picks up the spoon and has to hit the glass candle hard for the exact same ring to come back. We all sit in disbelief. We kept all our silverware in the drawer under the counter. Whatever was with us had to get a spoon out of the drawer, pick it up and smack the spoon halfway up the candle, and lay the spoon down on the counter without us hearing it hit the counter again. What the fuck? Whatever was gone had now returned. We all go back to the bathroom to look around in disbelief. We look for an explanation for a good 20 minutes. There was not one. We decide, screw it. Just a coincidence, and start heading back to Andre's room where we were before. We all walk back into the room following each other, and Eric is the last in the line. We're almost back in the room and we hear something fall and Eric say, "Ow." What the fuck was that? Something just hit me in the back of the head. We look around and by the candlelight see a Tupperware container laying on the ground that was simply not where it was before. We officially freak out and leave and go play in the snow for a few hours. We were gone for a while, and when we returned, we were all exhausted and ready to go to sleep. Things started happening in Andres and I room after that. Doors would close in front of us, sometimes locking themselves as well. This happened for a while. One time Andre and I had just finished up an MLB game on his Xbox and I was heading towards my room for bed. I walk through our bathroom and notice our toilet room door open and the light on. I notice that Andre is behind me by a few feet and leave it there so he can use it. I walk a few more feet and jokingly hear, "Way to go. Fucktard. You locked the bathroom door up." I turned around and asked, "What are you talking about?" "It's wide open." I turned the corner. It is closed, and it is locked. The 5 seconds it took me to leave the bathroom and him to walk in were all it took for the door to close and lock itself. This started happening regularly. Almost every day, my closet door would close and lock on its own. There was no way to fix it, and it continued like that for months with whatever it was just messing with us. It was now May, and we only had a few days left of sophomore year. We were counting down the days to get out of this haunted dorm room. We had already signed a lease for an apartment, so we knew we could finally get away from whatever was haunting us. One of the last nights we spent in that room, I was sick with the flu or something like that. I had been lying in bed for about an hour trying to get some rest. I heard Andre turn on the shower in the bathroom, and we usually left the door slightly open to keep the air from getting too musty. We also had the cheapest shower curtain we could find, clear, flimsy, and bought for about $3 at Dollar General. Anyway, I was laying there, about to fall asleep, when a few minutes later, I saw Andre walk into my room, wrapped in a towel. He asked me, "Did you need something from my room?" I looked at him, confused, and said, "No, I don't know what you mean." He looked at me for a moment and said, "Oh, okay. I was just wondering what you were doing in my room." I explained that I'd been in bed for over an hour. He turned pale and I could tell he was scared. At this point, I was still trying to figure out what was going on. He looked at me and said, "No, I just saw somebody walk from my bedroom into your room. Plain as day. I saw them walk through." I was in disbelief, but then it hit me. Whatever the hell had been messing with us had finally shown itself. I thought, holy shit. The remaining days we spent in that room felt like they dragged on forever. Both of us were terrified. Thankfully, nothing else happened after that, and I couldn't move out fast enough. Since then, we haven't experienced anything like it. But we still visit the grounds of Central State, and we found a wooded area with thousands of unmarked graves of people who had been deemed insane. It's incredibly creepy, that's for sure. We've even ghost hunted there a few times, though it's hard to stay long. We have a few clips from our hunts, one of which is when I asked if anyone was there, and a voice clearly responds, "I'm talking." Well, that's my story. I'm sure there are skeptics out there who think I'm making this all up, but it's all true. I've been through so much of that kind of stuff during my first 2 years of college that now, when anything happens, I just shrug and sarcastically think, well, that's great. So, if you're ever in Georgia and you're into paranormal things, make sure to stop by Milledgeville. You probably won't regret it. Back in high school, my house had a huge backyard connected to a large forest. When we were kids, my friends and I would often play games deep in the woods. There was always this small sense of danger, which made the adventures more exciting. But as we grew up, we stopped going into the forest because there didn't seem to be any reason for it anymore. Then one day, my friend Tyler and I were hanging out on the couch when he suggested going out into the woods late at night. What started as a casual walk quickly turned into the idea of camping overnight. Tyler mentioned his parents had a tent we could borrow, so we walked down the street to grab it from his garage. Neither of us had ever been camping before, so we really had no idea what we were doing. But neither of us thought much of it, since we'd only be out there for one night. After packing a bag with snacks, water, and a portable phone charger, we headed into the woods. Almost immediately, we realized the flashlight Tyler had brought was terrible. It barely lit up more than a few feet ahead of us, kept us from walking into trees, but we couldn't see much else. We talked excitedly for the first 15 minutes, but then the conversation died down, and we walked in silence for another 15 minutes. The silence of the woods was eerie, and I thought I heard footsteps nearby a couple of times, but the flashlight didn't reveal anything. After 30 minutes of walking, we found an open spot of grass surrounded by trees and decided to set up camp. Tyler wedged the flashlight on top of a bush to light the area, and we began to set up the tent. Tyler had said it would be easy, but it wasn't. We probably spent an hour just getting the tent to stay up without collapsing. And every time we thought we were getting somewhere, we'd hear a sound and have to grab the flashlight, shine it around, and then start all over with the tent. By the time we got the tent up, I was regretting coming out here. But once it was up, we settled inside, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was completely silent at times, then birds would chirp or some other animal would make noise. It was an interesting experience, until we both heard something more familiar. Footsteps. They were moving around the trees. They didn't sound like they were getting closer, but more like they were passing by. We both agreed that they were definitely human footsteps, not any animal. After a minute, they stopped, but we stayed silent, listening for anything else. About 10 minutes later, when we thought whoever it was had gone, we decided to leave the tent and sit outside. We both felt exposed sitting in the tent with no idea what was going on around us. While we sat and talked, we heard the footsteps again, but this time they were closer. They got so near that we thought the person might be walking directly toward us. Tyler quickly shone the flashlight in the direction of the footsteps, but the sound kept coming. They were walking slowly toward us. Just when we thought the person would step into the beam of the flashlight, they stopped. We were so close we could hear them breathing, but they were just outside the light. Both of us froze, staring at the darkness beyond the beam. Then we heard them take one step back and start walking away. A minute later, the footsteps faded, and the woods were silent again. We packed up the tent as fast as we could and left. We were so shaken up, we didn't even go the right way back and ended up on a neighboring street. We walked to my house and spent the rest of the night in my room, talking about what had happened or what could have happened. We never went back into those woods again, and even today, I avoid places that are isolated. Whoever that person was out there alone in the woods at night had to be up to something bad, and I feel like we were really close to finding out what it was. The neon sign buzzed and flickered as I pulled into the parking lot of the Starlight Motel. Little did I know, checking in that night would mark the start of a nightmare that would haunt me for years. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural, but the seemingly ordinary people we cross paths with every day. My name's Sarah, and I've always been a bit restless. I was on a cross-country road trip, searching for something, some sense of purpose, or whatever it is that people say they're looking for when they don't quite know what to do with their lives. It was late, I was exhausted, and the Starlight Motel was the first place in miles that looked like it might have a vacant room. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of old trucks and my dusty sedan. As I turned off the engine, I caught a glimpse of a curtain twitching in the office window. Someone had been watching me pull in. The bell over the door jingled as I entered the office. Behind the counter stood a man whose rough features made him seem like he'd been chiseled from stone. His name tag read Earl. "Need a room?" I asked, trying to sound confident, though I didn't feel it. Earl's eyes scanned me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Just you?" he asked, his voice raspy, like he'd been swallowing rocks. I nodded, instantly regretting that I was alone. "Got a single at the end," he muttered. $30, cash only. As I counted out the bills, I could feel his gaze boring into me. When I looked up, he was grinning. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Enjoy your stay," he said, handing me a key attached to a plastic fob shaped like a star. My room was at the far end of the motel, away from the office and the few other occupied rooms. As I unlocked the door, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The room was exactly what you'd expect for $30 a night. Sagging double bed, a TV that seemed ancient, and a bathroom that had seen better days. But it was a place to sleep, and that's all I needed. Just as I was about to collapse onto the bed, I noticed something strange. There was a small hole in the wall about eye level, partially hidden behind a cheap landscape painting. I leaned in for a closer look. The hole seemed to go straight through to the next room. A chill ran down my spine. Quickly, I pushed the painting back into place, trying to convince myself it was just wear and tear from a previous guest. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak and groan of the old building kept me on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there were eyes on me, despite the painting covering the hole. I must have eventually drifted off because I woke with a start in the early hours. Something had disturbed me, but I wasn't sure what. Then I heard it, a soft scratching sound from the wall. My heart began to race. I lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, straining to hear in the darkness. The scratching continued, stopping every now and then, only to pick back up again. Suddenly, a shaft of light appeared on the wall. The painting was shifting. Frozen in terror, I watched as the painting slowly moved to one side. The hole in the wall was exposed, and pressed against it was an eye. I must have made a sound, a gasp or whimper, because the eye widened in shock, then disappeared. I heard hurried footsteps moving away. That got me moving. I leaped out of bed, throwing on my clothes and shoving my belongings into my bag. I had to get out of there. As I burst out of my room, I nearly collided with someone. It was Earl, standing right outside my door. "Everything all right, miss?" he asked, his voice far too calm for someone who'd just been caught peeping. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now," Earl's face hardened. "Now, don't be hasty. It's the middle of the night. Not safe for a young woman to be driving alone." He took a step towards me, and I noticed for the first time how big he was, how he seemed to block out the light from the parking lot. "Stay away from me," I warned, fumbling in my bag for my car keys. That's when I saw the glint of metal in his hand. A knife. "Can't let you leave, miss," Earl said, his voice almost regretful. "You've seen too much." I didn't think, I just reacted. I swung my bag at his face with all my strength. He staggered back, momentarily stunned, and I ran. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding on the concrete. I reached my car, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Just as I wrenched the door open, a hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. Earl loomed over me, his face twisted with rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he growled. I saw the knife coming towards me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I brought my knee up hard, right between his legs. Earl doubled over with a grunt of pain, the knife clattering to the ground. I shoved him as hard as I could, sending him sprawling, and dove into my car. The engine roared to life and I floored it, tires squealing as I peeled out of the parking lot. In my rear view mirror, I could see Earl staggering to his feet, growing smaller as I sped away. I drove for hours, my heart pounding, jumping at every set of headlights I saw. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I finally felt safe enough to pull over at a busy truck stop. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone to call the police. I told them everything about the hole in the wall, Earl's behavior, the knife. They took my statement and assured me they'd investigate. As it turned out, I wasn't the first person to have a terrifying experience at the Starlight Motel. The police investigation uncovered a history of missing persons cases linked to the motel going back years. They found evidence that Earl had been spying on guests through holes in the walls, choosing his victims carefully. Those he thought wouldn't be missed: solo travelers, runaways, people down on their luck. In the end, they arrested Earl and his wife, who had been his accomplice. The full extent of their crimes was never made public, but the rumors were horrifying. I gave more statements, testified at the trial. It was a long and draining process, but I was determined to see justice done. Not just for me, but for all of Earl's victims who couldn't speak for themselves. It's been years since that night at the Starlight Motel, but I still have nightmares sometimes. I see Earl's cold eyes, feel the terror of being hunted. I can't stay in motels anymore. The sight of those identical doors, those neon vacancy signs, it all brings it rushing back. But I've grown stronger too. I've learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that little voice that says something isn't right. And I've learned that sometimes the most ordinary looking places and people can hide the darkest secrets. I still travel, still explore, but now I do it with my eyes wide open, always aware that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. And every time I pass a rundown motel on a lonely stretch of highway, I say a silent prayer for those who might be trapped inside, fighting battles that no one knows about. Because the truth is, you never really know what's happening behind closed doors, or who might be watching from the other side of the wall. For years ago, I rented an Airbnb for the holidays. I was visiting my family for Christmas and wanted a place just a few miles away from them. When I arrived on December 20th, everything was exactly as I expected. The house was pretty standard, located in a regular neighborhood. Overall, I was happy with the place. I arrived around 6 p.m. that first day, but I didn't feel like going out to see anyone just yet. I wanted a good night's rest, so I stayed in, relaxed, watched some TV, and even got a little work done. I went to bed just before 10 and fell asleep quickly. But in the middle of the night, I woke up slowly to a noise coming from downstairs. I was still half asleep and didn't even check the time, but it sounded like a few small thumps against the wall somewhere in the house. As I listened, I didn't feel scared or anything. I just assumed it was the house settling or the AC making noise. I stayed awake for only a minute before falling back to sleep, and I don't remember waking up again that night. By the time morning came, I had forgotten about the noises and didn't think anything of it. I was still pretty sure it was just the house or the AC unit. I let my family know I had made it into town, and we made plans for dinner at their place. I spent the morning and afternoon relaxing at the Airbnb until I was ready to head out. I grabbed my bag and keys, then walked to the front door to leave the house. But when I opened it, I was face to face with a man standing right on the porch. I was completely caught off guard, just standing there staring at him for a second before even saying anything. "Can I help you?" I asked. He didn't knock or ring the doorbell, which made me wonder how long he had been standing there and why he was there at all. He didn't answer my question but just nodded and then walked away. I watched him walk down the sidewalk and keep going until he was out of sight. It felt strange and creepy. Why was he at the Airbnb, and how long had he been standing there without knocking? I made sure the house was locked up and then drove to my parents' house for dinner. I mentioned the situation to my family, and they agreed it was just as creepy as I thought. Dinner was still nice, though, and we caught up on life and everything else. But that whole night, I couldn't stop thinking about that man and whether my things at the Airbnb would be safe. I left the dinner around 9 and got back to the Airbnb 15 minutes later. I parked in the driveway and walked up to the front door, looking around for any signs of someone being there while I was gone. But everything seemed fine, and I didn't notice anything unusual. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, walking down the hallway to the kitchen. I dropped my keys and bag on the counter, but then I heard a sudden thump. It was exactly like the ones I'd heard the previous night. But now that I was downstairs, it was much louder and clearly coming from one side of the house. I slowly walked into the room where the sound was coming from, but just as I reached the doorway, the thump happened again, this time from a door right next to me. I jumped back, adrenaline surging through me. After staring at the door for a few seconds, I could hear faint, heavy breathing from the other side. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and ran straight for my car. I still had no idea what was going on, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I called 911 and waited for them to arrive. When they showed up, I watched them go inside and search for a few minutes. Afterward, they came out and told me something horrifying. The door the noise was coming from was the garage door, which showed signs of attempted break-in, likely from someone trying to break the lock to get inside. Unbeknownst to me, there was a side door connected to the garage that led outside, and it had been left unlocked by whoever had stayed there before me. Since I had no intention of using the garage, I never checked it. It's unclear if the man I had seen on the porch was the same one trying to get into the garage, but just knowing that someone was right below me, trying to break in while I slept, is terrifying. We'll never know what their goal was after getting inside. Needless to say, I ended up staying at a hotel for the rest of the week. But even 4 years later, I still think about that situation often. When I was around 6 or 7, I was sleeping in my father's trailer with my 16-year-old neighbor, Kay, who was babysitting me. We were in the living room, separated from the kitchen by a bar that blocked most of the view. Kay was on the couch and I was lying on the floor near the TV, which was even farther from the kitchen. It was just the two of us, and the dog was curled up between us on the floor, sleeping soundly. I woke up suddenly for no apparent reason, jolting awake from a dreamless sleep with my heart racing. I noticed it was about 2 a.m., and the moonlight outside was so bright it looked like the sky before dawn, just before the sun rises. A few moments passed, and I tried to find a clock to check the time, but before I could, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a laugh, but not like any laugh I had ever heard. It was on a loop, repeating 3 times, with each laugh varying in length. Some were short, some stretched on for what felt like too long. The laughter was high-pitched, mechanical, and flat, like a distorted, broken voice box mixed with a toy malfunctioning. It was almost like a warped version of my mom's voice, but not quite right, too robotic and unnatural. Sometimes it would stop, only to start again in random intervals of 3, each one just as strange as the last. I could tell the sound was coming from the kitchen, specifically from the white plastic chair my dad often sat in near the hallway. I was so terrified that I jumped on top of Kay, accidentally ramming my knee into her body as I scrambled to avoid looking in the direction of the kitchen. She woke up, groaning sleepily, clearly annoyed but not angry, and tried to soothe me, telling me to go back to sleep. But I was too panicked. In a hushed, frantic whisper, I told her that there was something wrong coming from the kitchen. She went quiet suddenly, her face went tense, and her eyes widened. We both heard the next round of laughter. I asked, "Do you hear that?" And she nodded, hugging me tightly as I buried my face in her. I looked at her, eyes wide with terror, and whispered, "I'm afraid." She replied softly, "I know, I'm scared too." We were both on the verge of tears. Kay tried to calm me down and said she was going to check if any friends were outside, trying to figure out if someone was messing with us. I panicked and begged her not to leave me, clinging to her torso in hand, shaking violently with fear. She calmly but quickly tried to pull away, telling me to stay put while she went outside. She went out the front door, and I heard the laughter continue, though it seemed to grow more distant as she looked around the trailer and down the road. Kay came back inside after checking around the trailer, but the laughter still persisted, gradually decreasing in intervals until it finally stopped altogether. We huddled together on the couch, both of us avoiding the kitchen, and the sound finally stopped. We both eventually drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the fear. I should mention that the dog, who had been lying on the couch, was awake, her eyes wide with fear, trembling violently, avoiding the kitchen just as we were. The next day, my dad was told about the incident and spent the afternoon searching the living room, bar, and kitchen, trying to find any toy or object that could have made that noise. But nothing explained what had happened. He found nothing. I knew I had no noise-making toys. I liked Barbies and cheap stuffed animals, all of which were at the opposite end of the trailer in my room anyway with a closed door. There was no explanation, and the girl never babysat me again from her own intense fear of reliving that. This is my second shared encounter. Me, age 6 or 7, and my friend who was about 9 months older than me but in the same grade. I was being babysat by my childhood friend's mom. She was babysitting me as a request from my dad, who always found a way to isolate me from my mom. My friend's name, for the sake of identity protection, will be C. C and I were in the living room on separate sides of a huge sectional, so big that I was against the wall on one side of the living room and she was on the other side. She was near the hallway leading to the other 2 rooms and bathrooms where her mom and older brother both slept and were snoring. C and I started hearing that same distorted, loud, horrific laughing at different intervals, which was coming from behind the tiny island separating the kitchen from the open living room. There was only a few feet behind the tiny island we could not see. Our eyes were as wide as saucers. We were both holding big cheap stuffed animals for comfort, and we were both cocooned in our blankets with our heads exposed. We both stared at the kitchen where the island blocked our view. Then our eyes shot from there to each other in absolute horror. I said, "That's the sound I heard." We both stared at each other with huge eyes and whispered about what it could be, stating that we are so scared, and we also came to the only agreed action that we could do: ignore it and keep our eyes closed. We did until we fell asleep. I remember it happened for weeks. Eventually, I fell asleep after the sound was experienced one night by us both. I woke up with my back arched, like an upside-down U, dizzy, facing the ceiling, jammed against the floor and wall. My knees and legs bent hard and my arms bent, strained with contorted rigid hands like someone who had a stroke. I was covered in vomit. I have always had and still have no memory of anything that happened. I asked her mom why I was on the floor after unbending my tense, strained body. Her and her mom both said my eyes were open. I was not talking in words. Instead, I screamed randomly many times, going in and out of puking, blood-curdling screaming to frantic, wordless, senseless babbling. And I went in and out saying that I was going to puke, that there was something wrong and help me. They were both in disbelief that I didn't remember anything, and C was really upset because I got vomit on her stuffed elephant. She was scared to go near me for weeks. She could not describe what happened to me very well, but I saw the fear and confusion in her eyes from the experience. I remember the sound that haunted me was never experienced by me or my childhood friend together or separately again. In my older age, I still have no hereditary family history of mental illness in either side of my family. Also, me personally having no mental illness, only trauma related to PTSD, depression, and anxiety. After studying a lot in psychology, mental illness, other various mental and physical illnesses, and tons of research, I know that two separate people cannot simultaneously experience the exact same auditory or visual hallucination together. It's odd how certain places can get under your skin. You pass them every day without a second thought, but then one day something shifts. A change in the light, a shadow where none existed before, and suddenly you can't shake the feeling that something's different. That's exactly how it was with the old barn on the edge of town. I'd driven by it countless times, barely giving it any attention, until one evening when I couldn't shake the sensation that something, was watching me through those dark windows. The barn was a remnant of another era, nestled at the edge of a field that had been left to grow wild for years. Its roof sagged in places, and the wood had faded to a grayish hue. Yet it stood there, like a forgotten monument, looming over the landscape. No one ever seemed to go there. The land had been abandoned years ago after the owners had passed, and the property was left to decay. That particular day, I was heading home from work, taking the usual back roads, when I felt it. A chill ran down my spine, and my eyes instinctively flicked to the barn. It looked the same as always, but something was different. The windows were dark, unnaturally dark for the time of day, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement inside. I shook the thought away, attributing it to exhaustion. But as I passed by, I found myself slowing down, my gaze glued to the barn. Something came over me, and before I even realized it, I had pulled over and stepped out of the car. The air was cool, carrying the scent of overgrown grass that swayed gently in the breeze. I stood for a moment, staring at the barn, my heart beating harder than it should have. It was just an old structure, after all. There was no reason to be scared. Yet, unease crept in as I walked across the field toward it. With each step, the barn seemed to loom larger, more threatening. As I got closer, I saw how rundown it truly was. The windows were filthy, coated with dust and cobwebs, and the wooden doors hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I paused before the doors, my hand hovering above the rough wood. A part of me wanted to turn around and drive off, to forget I'd even stopped. But another part of me, the part one couldn't ignore, needed to know what was inside. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in the silence, and the musty smell of damp wood and dust hit me as I stepped in. The barn was much larger inside than it appeared from the outside. The high rafters disappeared into darkness. The only light came from the few cracks in the walls where the setting sun seeped through, casting narrow beams of light across the dirt floor. At first glance, the barn seemed empty. Just old farm equipment, broken crates, and piles of hay that looked untouched for decades. But as I ventured further in, something caught my eye. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of rotting wood, was an old ladder leading up to a loft. It was rickety and worn, the kind of thing you wouldn't trust to hold your weight. But there was something strange about it, something that made me feel like it hadn't always been there. I hesitated, glancing around the barn one last time before making my way to the ladder. My heart was racing now, and every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to get back in my car, and drive as far away as possible. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was up there. The ladder creaked under my weight, and for a moment, I thought it might give way. But somehow I made it to the top. The loft was small, just a cramped space tucked under the barn's roof, with the same smell of damp and decay that filled the rest of the building. But there, in the middle of the floor, was something that didn't belong. A wooden chest. It was old, much older than anything else in the barn. The wood was dark and polished, with intricate carvings that had been worn smooth with time. A thick layer of dust covered it, but it looked untouched, like it had been hidden up here for years, waiting for someone to find it. My hands were shaking as I knelt down in front of the chest, brushing away the dust. The carvings were strange, almost like symbols, though I couldn't quite make out what they were supposed to represent. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the latch, before finally giving in to the curiosity that had led me this far. The latch clicked open and I lifted the lid. Inside the chest, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was a small, weathered journal. Its leather cover was cracked and brittle, but the pages inside were still intact, their edges yellowed with age. I picked it up carefully, my hands trembling as I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was old-fashioned, looping, and elegant, but the words themselves were barely legible. Faded, almost erased, as if someone had tried to remove them. I squinted, trying to make sense of the faint script. November 17th, 1922. It's here. I saw it again tonight in the barn, watching me from the shadows. It's always watching. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. The nights are worse now. It won't let me sleep. I could feel it waiting. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I read the words. My hands trembled so violently that I nearly dropped the journal. What was this? Who had written it? And what had they encountered in the barn? I flipped through the pages. Most of the entries faded, the ink barely visible, as if someone or something had tried to erase them from existence. But one thing was unmistakable. Whoever had written this was terrified. Something had haunted them in this barn, something they couldn't escape. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the barn, and I froze. I wasn't alone. My heart raced in my chest as I stood up slowly, clutching the journal to my chest. The sound had come from below, from the floor of the barn. Someone or something was down there moving around. I slowly edged toward the ladder, my hands slick with sweat as the sound of footsteps grew louder. I peered over the edge, my breath catching in my throat. The barn appeared empty, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. They continued, circling the barn slowly, deliberately. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't make out a figure in the dim light, but I could feel it. The same presence the journal had described, that same eerie sense of being watched. I scrambled down the ladder, my hands slipping on the rough wood, and bolted for the door. The footsteps followed, growing faster, closer, as if something was chasing me, something I couldn't see. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted out of the barn, my breath ragged as I tore across the field. My car was still parked by the side of the road, the engine off, the world eerily silent. But that feeling, the presence, was still there, watching me, following me as I raced toward the safety of my car. I didn't stop until I was behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the barn, the journal still clutched tightly in my hands. My heart didn't slow down until the barn had disappeared from my rearview mirror, swallowed by the dimming light of the evening. I never returned to that barn, never told a soul about what I found, what I heard. But sometimes, late at night, I pull out the journal and stare at the faded pages, the words still haunting me. And I wonder what was watching me in that barn. And is it still there, waiting for someone else to find it? This story took place about 7 months ago with me and my friend, who I'll call Anna. In our town, there's a popular bridge with train tracks underneath it, and a lot of people go there to smoke, drink, or just hang out. It was the summer before my senior year, and Anna and I were bored one Saturday night, as there isn't much to do where I live. So, we decided to head to the bridge for a change of scenery. The bridge has 2 ways to get there. The first way involves turning down a side street and parking on a small gravel strip. After that, you walk a bit and then climb down a steep slope of dirt and rocks to reach the train tracks. You have to cross the tracks and then climb some rocks on the side of the bridge to get to where we usually hang out. The second way to get there is from the other side. You just hop down off the street, and there's a short trail that leads directly to the spot. You don't have to cross the tracks or anything. Anyway, Anna and I arrived at the bridge around 10:30 or 11 p.m., so it was pretty dark. We didn't think much of it. We lived in a small, quiet town where nothing bad ever really happened. We parked, grabbed our phones to use as flashlights, and made our way down the slope, trying not to fall as we laughed and joked around. After we made it down, we climbed up the rocks to the spot with the couches and small fire pit. I sat on one of the folding chairs by the pillar, while Anna settled onto the couch. We were just chatting and vaping, and everything felt normal at first. But after about 20 minutes, I started hearing small sounds like something or someone moving around in the woods, which was right next to the tracks. Then, I suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, trying to see if anyone was there, but it was so dark that I couldn't even see my own hand in front of me. I could tell Anna was starting to feel the same way. We exchanged a look, that silent, mutual recognition that something was off. Then Anna asked me what I was doing, trying to move my arm down. I told her to be quiet and shined my flashlight in the direction I thought we were being watched from. Anna started to quietly panic, and I told her to stay calm. We tried to convince ourselves we were just being paranoid. But the flashlight didn't reach far, and the area it did cover was empty. Yet the noises kept happening, and they were getting more frequent, which made us both panic even more. We started to discuss the situation. If there was someone there, where would they be hiding? How long had they been there? Were there more than one of them? Anna then got the stupid idea to shout, "Hello? Is anyone there? Or chill, you don't have to hide." We sat in silence for 5 minutes as nothing happened and the noises stopped. It was dead silent. Then all of a sudden, an empty plastic water bottle was thrown in our direction. We could see where it landed only a few feet from us, and we were scared absolutely out of our minds. Now we knew that someone had been there watching us. Anna said we needed to get out of there, but we were both too scared to move, afraid that if we did, whoever was there would come out and attack us as we tried to climb down the rocks. We heard a twig snap, and I nearly screamed. Anna decided that she was going to jump off the edge of the ledge we were sitting on. I grabbed her arm and said it's too high to jump off of. You can't even see all the way down to where the tracks are, and made her stay with me. By now, we had been there for at least 45 minutes to an hour. Had he just been there watching us the whole time? We calmed down and decided that when we count to 3, we were going to run across the rocks and book it across the tracks and back up the slope to the car. I counted 123. When I said it, we ran as fast as we could, not looking back to see who was there. We made it back up the hill completely out of breath. We decided to walk over the bridge and see if we could hear anything. We stood on the bridge above the opposite side where we had been sitting before. We called down shouting, "Who's there? You better leave now," and a bunch of other things in a few obscenities that I won't repeat on here. We heard a scuffling and rocks moving directly under us. When we were running across earlier, he must have tried to chase us. And when we made it to the top, he just went to the other side of the tracks and climbed up those rocks. There was no way that he had been there the whole time, as he had thrown a water bottle at us earlier, and it would have been too far to throw it from the other side, and it came from a completely different direction. We got really freaked out and started to leave and then heard a train coming. I grabbed my friend's arm and said, "Wait, if we wait for the train, maybe we can see who was watching us." She agreed, and we slowly and cautiously walked back down to the slope as the train began to approach. The train lights were so bright, and at first we couldn't see anyone. Then I looked over to the pillars, and to my absolute horror, I see someone wearing a white and purple beanie with the blankiest eyes I had ever seen peek around one of the pillars. He looked strung out and like he was on something. He saw me immediately and ducked back behind the pillar. I screamed as me and my friend turned to sprint back up to our car before the train passed so he couldn't follow us. We booked it out of there and have been back at night ever since. I still get freaked out that he had been watching us the whole time we were down there, and if he did manage to get us while we were running, what would he have done? I don't know, and I certainly don't want to find out. The first note showed up on a Tuesday, slipped under the front door like a whisper of danger. "Get out while you can," it read in jagged, urgent handwriting. I laughed it off as a prank, but as the days passed and the messages grew darker, I began to realize that what was supposed to be a simple house-sitting job had turned into a waking nightmare. It was meant to be an easy gig. My college roommate, Sarah, had asked me to watch her house for a month while she was on a work assignment overseas. Her place was a charming Victorian in a quiet neighborhood, with a white picket fence and a garden that would make any gardener envious. I jumped at the opportunity. A month away from my cramped studio apartment sounded like a dream. The first few days were peaceful. I watered the plants, collected the mail, and spent my evenings relaxing on Sarah's comfortable couch, binge-watching shows on her large TV. It was quiet, almost too quiet compared to the constant noise of my apartment building. And then came the first note. I found it when I returned from grocery shopping, a small piece of paper lying innocently on the welcome mat. The message was short but unsettling. "Get out while you can." I turned it over, searching for any clue as to its origin, but found nothing. Just those 5 words, scrawled in black marker. I shook my head, crumpled the paper, and tossed it in the trash. Probably just some kids playing a prank. I tried to forget about it and went on with my day. The second note came 2 days later, slipped under the door sometime during the night. I discovered it the next morning when I went downstairs for my coffee. This one was longer. "The walls have eyes. Asterisk, they know you're here. Leave now." Asterisk, a chill ran through me as I read it. The handwriting was the same as the first note, but there was an urgency to this one. I found myself glancing at the walls, half expecting to see eyes staring back at me. "Don't be ridiculous," I told myself. "It's just another stupid prank." But a gnawing unease settled in. I started double-checking the locks before bed and drawing the curtains tightly against the night. The third note appeared the very next day, stuck to the bathroom mirror when I stepped out of the shower. My heart nearly stopped when I saw it, dripping water onto the tile floor. How had someone gotten inside? The message was even more disturbing than the others. "They're coming for you. I can't hold them back much longer. Run." I called the police, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. They arrived, took a report, but found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints on the notes. They suggested it might just be kids in the neighborhood and promised to increase patrols. I called Sarah next, hoping she had some idea of who might want to scare her, or me, out of the house. But she was just as puzzled as I was, insisting she had good relationships with all her neighbors. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind outside had me sitting up, heart racing. I kept the bedroom door locked, a chair wedged under the handle just in case. The fourth note was waiting for me the next morning, slipped under my bedroom door despite my precautions. 2 words were written larger than the others, covering the entire page. "Too late." I ran. I didn't even pack a bag, just grabbed my phone and keys and bolted out the front door in my pajamas. I drove for hours, my mind racing with questions. Who was leaving these notes? What did they mean? And why me? It was dark by the time I gathered the courage to return to the house. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the darkened windows, half expecting to see a shadowy figure watching me. Finally, I took a deep breath and went inside. The house was quiet, exactly as I'd left it in my panicked flight. I did a thorough search, checking every room, every closet, even under the beds. Nothing seemed out of place. No new notes. I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted and confused. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this really was just an elaborate prank that had gone too far. That's when I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from inside the walls. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, like something was moving within the very structure of the house. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Then a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Help us." I scrambled off the couch, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Show yourself." More whispers joined the first, a chorus of barely audible voices pleading for help. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, growing louder with each passing second. I ran to the front door, yanking it open, ready to flee again, but I stopped short at the threshold. The street outside was wrong. The houses across the way were twisted, their shapes elongated and warped as if seen through funhouse mirrors. The sky above was a swirling mass of unnatural colors, and I could see things moving in it, things that defied description. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming. The whispers were all around me now, accompanied by that awful scratching sound. The walls seemed to pulse, the wallpaper rippling like waves on water. A new note appeared, materializing out of thin air to flutter to the ground at my feet. With trembling hands, I picked it up. "We tried to warn you," it read. "Now you're one of us." As I read those words, I felt a strange sensation, as if the very substance of my being was changing. I looked down at my hands and watched in horror as they began to fade, becoming translucent. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was becoming part of the house, my consciousness merging with the others trapped within its walls. In my last moments of individuality, I understood the truth. This house was a trap, a living entity that lured in victims and absorbed them. Sarah, my friends, my family, they had never existed. They were fabrications, false memories implanted by the house to draw me in. How many others had fallen for this trick? How many souls were trapped here, their essences used to feed this monstrous dwelling? As my physical form dissolved completely, my awareness spread throughout the structure. I could feel the others now, countless minds all linked together in a vast, horrifying network. And I knew that soon, another unsuspecting victim would come, a new house sitter perhaps, or a curious buyer attracted by the quaint Victorian on the quiet street. I wanted to warn them, to tell them to run while they still could. But all I could do was whisper, my voice joining the chorus of the damned, trapped forever in this house of horrors. As my consciousness faded into the collective, one last thought echoed through what remained of my mind. I should have heeded the warnings. I should have gotten out while I still could. But now, like all the others, I was part of the house, and the house was always hungry for more. A year ago, I moved into a commune house in Onheim. Everything seemed fine on my floor, but there were two people who were acting a bit strange. As time went on, one of them, Jack, started making odd and unsettling comments. He has a 3-year-old child who lives in Hungary with his girlfriend, but he's been in Germany for 3 years. He often talks about sexy girls and what he'd like to do with them. Jack would frequently walk around half naked, even when it was cold, and give me strange, almost hungry looks alongside his compliments. It didn't take long to realize that Jack had no respect for women. One of the conversations that still bothers me to this day is when he said that you can only truly love one person. The man loves the woman, and the woman loves the child. That gives you an idea of his mindset. Then, for 1 semester, Jack studied in Uganda, and the owner rented the room to a 40-year-old woman from China named Lin. But Jack came back a month earlier than expected, and that's when things took a turn for the worse. He broke into the empty room next to mine to sleep there. He started being passive-aggressive and pressured Lin to take in his belongings. He'd knock on her door at odd hours just to say good night, or move his things around slowly without actually taking anything out of his luggage. One morning, around 6 a.m., I was getting ready to visit a friend in another city when I noticed a commotion outside Lin's room. She was pacing nervously in her evening robe. I invited her into my room for a few minutes, and she broke down, telling me how scared she was of Jack, worried that he might take her things or even hurt her. She also felt pressured by him because Jack had told her he would be extremely disappointed if she moved his things out. The truth was, they didn't even know each other well. They met briefly at a 3-day prayer session and barely spoke. I reassured Lin, telling her not to be afraid and that I would support her. She ended up writing in our floor's WhatsApp group, saying she wanted to remove Jack's stuff. After Jack tried to manipulate her with guilt, I stepped in, stating that she was doing the right thing. Jack's reaction was immediate. His tone changed drastically, and he threatened me, telling me to shut my mouth. Apparently, he knocked on my door while I was at my friend's place. My boyfriend opened the door, and when I got home, he was in shock. He told me that Jack had been ranting, saying he could make me disappear. My boyfriend then shared a story that had me locking my door every night from then on. Apparently, Jack bragged about taking me to a place called Gala. Jack and his friends were used to going out. One of them would try to seduce a girl. He would bring her home, bandage her eyes, and another person would have their way with her without her knowing it. For 2 weeks now, not only Jack would behave strangely, even Lin started being different. She only saw sides. Whoever didn't agree was an enemy, and she developed a paranoia. Lin eventually moved out. Since then, she stalked one other girl who stays in the floor who was a former friend of hers. Lin even stood in front of her window watching this former friend. She didn't want to do anything else out of fear. Jack still lives here. He's still passive-aggressive and tries to get me kicked out of the building and insults me and the group me. I'm just scared of what he's capable of. Both Lin and Jack gave me the creeps, and I don't know if I have the money to leave. The moment I saw the body wash up on our pristine beach, I knew our romantic getaway had just turned into a nightmare. What I didn't realize was that it was only the beginning of a terrifying ordeal that would push us to the very edge of survival. My name's Alex, and what was supposed to be a week of sun, sand, and serenity with my girlfriend, Mia, quickly turned into a desperate fight for our lives. It all started on a Tuesday, our 3rd day on the small private island we'd rented for a much-needed vacation. We'd spent the morning snorkeling in the crystal-clear waters, marveling at the colorful fish and vibrant coral reefs. As we walked hand in hand along the beach, basking in the warm afternoon sun, Mia suddenly stopped, her grip tightening on my hand. "Alex," she said, her voice tight with shock. "Look." I followed her gaze and my stomach dropped. There, half buried in the wet sand at the water's edge, was a man. His bloated face was turned towards us, eyes wide and unseeing, skin pale and mottled. "Oh my God," I breathed, instinctively pulling Mia closer. "Is he?" But we both knew the answer. No one could survive in that condition. We approached cautiously, some morbid sense of duty pushing us to check for any signs of life, however unlikely. As we got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. An unnatural, neat hole in the center of the man's forehead. This wasn't an accidental drowning. This man had been murdered. "We need to call the police," Mia said, her voice trembling. I nodded, already pulling out my phone. But as I raised it to search for a signal, my heart sank. No bars. We were too far from the nearest cell tower. "The villa," I said, panicking. "There's a landline there. We can use that." We hurried back up the beach, glancing over our shoulders with every step. The idyllic paradise we'd been enjoying just moments ago now felt menacing. Every rustle of palm leaves and crash of waves seemed to hold potential threats. As we neared the villa, something felt wrong. The door, one we had definitely closed when we left, was slightly ajar. "Wait here," I told Mia, grabbing a piece of driftwood to use as a makeshift weapon. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at every creak. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the place had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, their contents scattered across the floor. Our suitcases had been emptied, clothes tossed everywhere. "Alex," Mia called from outside. "Is everything okay?" Before I could answer, I heard a noise from the bedroom. Footsteps. Someone was still here. I acted on pure instinct, slamming the front door shut and locking it, trapping whoever was inside with me. More importantly, I was keeping Mia safe outside. "Run," I shouted. "I get help." I heard Mia's startled cry, followed by the sound of her feet on the wooden deck. Then a figure burst from the bedroom, tall and muscular, dressed in dark clothes. In his hand was a wicked-looking knife. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both surprised by the confrontation. Then he lunged. I swung my piece of driftwood, catching him on the arm. He grunted in pain but didn't slow down. The knife flashed in the dim light, and I felt a searing pain across my ribs as I barely managed to dodge. We grappled, crashing into furniture, neither of us able to gain the upper hand. He was stronger, but I was fighting for my life, for Mia's life. Adrenaline surged through me, dulling the pain from my wound. Somehow, I managed to knock the knife from his hand. It skittered across the floor, disappearing under a cabinet. He roared in frustration, his hands closing around my throat. Black spots danced in my vision as I struggled for air. In desperation, I brought my knee up hard. He doubled over, his grip loosening. I took the opportunity to slam my forehead into his nose. There was a sickening crunch, and he stumbled back, blood pouring down his face. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I ran for the door, fumbling with the lock. Just as I got it open, I felt his hand grab the back of my shirt. I spun, my elbow connecting with his already broken nose. He went down hard, and this time he stayed down. I staggered outside, gasping for air. "Mia," I called out. "Mia, where are you?" There was no answer. The beach was empty. No sign of her anywhere. Fear gripped me. Had there been more than one intruder? Had they gotten to her while I was fighting for my life inside? I was about to start searching when I heard a groan from inside the villa. The intruder was coming to. I couldn't leave him here to potentially hurt Mia if she came back. I needed to restrain him to get answers. I found some zip ties in a drawer and secured his hands behind his back. As he regained consciousness, I demanded answers. "Where's Mia? Who are you? What do you want?" He just laughed. A chilling sound. "You're in way over your head, boy. You have no idea what's going on here." Then enlighten me, I growled. He smirked, despite his battered face. "This island isn't as private as you think. It's a drop point, that man you found on the beach. He was supposed to make a delivery. When he didn't show, we came looking." My mind raced. A drop point? For what? Drugs? Weapons? What about Mia? I demanded. "Where is she? If she's smart, she's long gone by now. But don't worry, my partners will find her soon enough." Partners? There were more of them out there, and they had Mia. I needed to find her. Fast, but I couldn't leave this guy alone, and I couldn't take him with me. I made a quick decision, using more zip ties to secure him to a heavy wooden chair. "If anything happens to Mia," I said, leaning in close, "I'll make you wish you'd never set foot on this island." He just smiled, showing blood-stained teeth. "Good luck out there. You're gonna need it." I grabbed a kitchen knife and headed out, my heart pounding. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the beach. Where would Mia have gone? Then I remembered, on our first day here, we'd discovered a small sea cave on the far side of the island. We joked about using it as a hideout if pirates ever attacked. It wasn't funny anymore. I made my way along the beach, staying close to the tree line for cover. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I was painfully aware of how exposed I was. As I neared the cave, I heard voices. Men's voices, rough and angry. And then, blessedly, Mia's voice. She was alive. I crept closer, trying to get a better look. Two men, both armed, stood at the mouth of the cave. Mia was inside, her hands tied behind her back. Just tell us where it is. One of the men was saying, your boyfriend must have found it when he searched the body. I don't know what you're talking about. Mia sobbed. Please just let us go. I had to do something. But what? I was outnumbered and outgunned. Then it hit me, the flare gun from the villa's emergency kit. I hadn't brought it with me, but maybe I could bluff. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my hiding spot. Let her go, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I have what you're looking for. The men spun around, their guns raised. Where is it? One demanded. Not here, I said, trying to sound confident. It's hidden, and if anything happens to us, a flare will go up, alerting the authorities. So unless you want company, I suggest you back off. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the men lowered their weapons. Smart move, kid, the one in charge said, his tone almost admiring. Now, where's the package? I gestured vaguely toward the villa. I'll take you there, I said. But first, let Mia go. He nodded at his partner, who untied Mia. She ran to me, throwing her arms around me. I could feel her trembling against me. It's okay, I whispered. We're going to be okay. What happened next was a blur. As we made our way back toward the villa, I managed to whisper to Mia about the flare gun. When we got close, I pretended to trip, using the distraction to scoop up a handful of sand. I threw it into the men's eyes, yelling at Mia to run. We sprinted for the villa, bullets flying past us. We barely made it inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The man I had tied up earlier looked up in surprise. The flare gun, I gasped to Mia, in the emergency kit. She found it just as the men outside began battering the door. With trembling hands, I aimed it out the window and fired. The flare lit up the night sky, a bright red star of hope. In the distance, we heard the unmistakable sound of a boat engine. The men outside cursed, realizing their time was up. We heard them running away, their footsteps fading into the night. The villa, once full of tension, became eerily quiet. As the sound of the approaching boat grew louder, Mia and I held each other, hardly daring to believe it was finally over. The authorities arrived soon after, alerted by the flare. The full story came out. The island had been a drop point for a major drug smuggling operation. The man we found on the beach had been a mule who tried to double-cross his bosses. In the end, our vacation turned into weeks of police statements and court appearances. But we were alive, and the smuggling ring was shut down. Now, whenever Mia and I talk about taking a vacation, we joke about sticking to crowded tourist beaches. But beneath the humor, there's a newfound appreciation for each other and for life itself. We learned the hard way that paradise can hide dangers, and that, when pushed to the brink, we're capable of more than we ever imagined. Our peaceful beach getaway turned into a fight for survival, but it also revealed the strength of our love and our will to live, and that's a souvenir worth more than any seashell or snapshot. Last summer, I came across stories about them. The black-eyed children were always my favorite ghost tale. Honestly, until last night, I thought they were just that, stories. Most of the tales I'd read seemed to happen in far-off towns in the Midwest. Since I live on the East Coast, I assumed I was far removed from any such occurrences. For anyone who doesn't know, the stories typically involve two children, a young girl and a little boy who asked for help getting home. Sometimes these events unfold at night, other times just before dawn. My encounter happened at 1:04 a.m. on Sunday, June 1st. I had spent the evening watching a double feature of science fiction films at my neighbor's place. Just me, Zeke, and Harry. His house was only about a quarter of a mile away, so I walked over expecting to hang out and have a few drinks. Everything had gone well up to that point. After the movie ended, Zeke kicked Harry and me out, saying he had a date in the morning and needed some rest. So Harry and I started walking home together. Harry's place was halfway between Zeke's and mine. He offered me a cigarette, but I declined as we chatted about our year at university. He suggested giving me a ride home, but since the weather was nice, I turned him down. What was I thinking? As I reached the end of the street at the T intersection, I turned right toward my house, and that's when I felt it. A strange vibration in the air. It made my fillings buzz in my mouth, and it was incredibly uncomfortable. That's when I saw them. Two pale children emerged from behind a house straight ahead. I got a chill down my spine. At this point, it was already 1 a.m., and I was starting to feel uneasy, so I decided to jog the rest of the way home. The closer I got to my house, the more children I saw. It felt like they were everywhere. Dozens of them, all with those eerie black eyes, crying out for help. Help us! Help us! I sprinted as fast as I could to my house, dodging a few of them that were too close. When I finally reached my door, I struggled with my keys, and that's when I felt a small hand brush against my shirt. I slammed the door behind me as soon as I could. I thought for sure my parents and brother would come out to see what was going on, but no one did. I ran upstairs to wake them, but the house was empty. I ran to my room in the basement and glanced back outside to see a sea of children standing still, staring at my house. I tried using my phone and laptop, but neither could get a signal. I sat there, holding my favorite knife, and eventually, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up to my dad asking for help with yard work. He told me he'd been asleep in bed with my mom all night, and he's insisted several times that I stop making up stories. Now, I fear what tonight might bring. In December of 2012, I enlisted in the Navy. By March 2014, I had transferred from a technical school in the Great Lakes to another one in Virginia Beach. The first few months in Virginia, I was placed in temporary housing at a place called the Navy Gateway. It was essentially a hotel with a twin bed in each unit. It was actually pretty nice. When I wasn't in class, I spent most of my time on the pier or hanging out with friends outdoors. I didn't spend much time in my room, other than to sleep. A few months into my schooling, I was given orders to move to an older barracks. Building 508 was one of the oldest buildings on base, but the rooms had a different layout, and the closets were much bigger. The carpets were older, and the sheets and amenities weren't provided anymore, but honestly, I didn't mind. I had a lot of stuff and preferred less interaction with base personnel. Plus, with just 6 months left on the base, I'd rather live somewhere I could make feel more like an apartment. Even though the daily cleaning service was gone, I wasn't stuck with the terrible cable that came with the Navy Gateway. I had a cable company come out to wire my room with digital cable and Wi-Fi. I started spending more time in this room since some of my friends had left for other stations, and the 10-foot ceilings and extra shelves gave it a nice feel. The only downside was that the fan and overhead light didn't work with the remote control by the door. Each unit had 2 bedrooms with locking doors and a shared common area with a bathroom, fridge, cabinets, and a small sink area. The first day I moved over, I remember seeing the door to room 320A was closed. I was assigned to the other bedroom, 320B, which was also closed. I did a quick inspection and noticed a wet towel hanging on the rack and moisture in the sink. Then, I heard a voice coming from the other bathroom. Damn, I thought. I was hoping to have the unit to myself. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving my things from the gateway to building 508. On my second trip, I noticed a strong smell of freshly sprayed cologne. With my arms full of bags, I didn't want to keep digging out my key card, so I locked the deadbolt to keep the door propped open. After about the 4th trip back, I opened the front door to the common space and noticed that my door had been shut. The deadbolt was locked again. The door was closed and latched, and my wallet was on the bedroom floor. Great, I thought. My roommate is being inconsiderate. So, I walked over to the building that handled key card assignments. It wasn't close to 508, but I had to do it. I explained the situation to the girl at the front desk, and we walked across the base together so she could let me back into my room. I told her I'm sorry, and the guy who lives in Unit A must have closed the door for some reason, to which she replied, nobody lives in A. I told her that can't be and explained everything that had happened. But she took a master key and opened the door to that room, and it was completely bare. The mattress was flipped up, the drawers pulled out and emptied. Everything was just as it should be for a new resident to move in. Turns out I actually did have the unit to myself, so that obviously freaked me out a bit. Fast forward a few weeks and fall was moving in. I love fall and cool crisp air, so at nighttime might crack my window open. Sure, it would get too cold by morning, but I love waking up when it's 58 inside and the heater is off. Well, I continued this tradition every night until one night it got really cold. It was about 40 outside and not much warmer inside. I was startled awake sometime after midnight by 3 knocks on my door. There were quick friendly knocks too, mind you, and this came from the outside of my bedroom door, not the unit. So it was in the kitchen and common area. I thought I imagined it, so I waited about 15 seconds, but then it happened again. I got up thinking that someone is obviously wanting to speak with me, and I opened the door, but there was nobody there. Right after it closed, there were 3 knocks again. I thought maybe it was coming from the hallway, so I opened the door again and walked through the common area and checked the peephole into the hallway. Nothing. I went back into my room and looked around. I mean, could there be something loose or swinging or creaking? An animal on the wall. I walked all around the room quietly looking and listening for anything, but there was nothing. Nothing happened for another minute or two too, so I just went back to bed. But the second I pulled the covers up over me, there were 3 knocks again, and this time they definitely had to have been on my door. No question about it. I walked up to the door, but I didn't open it this time. I just looked at it, and then there were 3 more knocks. 10 more seconds of staring, and then 3 more knocks again. At this point, it really hadn't even crossed my mind that it could be something paranormal. I was just so unbelievably baffled at what could be causing this. The room was still cold from my opening the window all night, but a combination of realizing that I think something paranormal is going on and that maybe the feeling of some of the energy shifts, I began to shudder. I mean, it must have been 20 degrees in that room just then, and realizing that something bigger than me was at work here, my attitude shifted dramatically right then. My demeanor went from aggressive, oh my gosh, shut up, to very submissive, like what can I do to not have a horror movie made up about me? Long story short, I ran over to the window and shut it, and the knocks just stopped. I felt much more comfortable, and the mood in the room instantly brightened up, and for some reason I felt like the room was more peaceful, or at least whatever this was didn't want to bother me. I, of course, had to test this theory over the coming months. The window open always got the 3 knocks, and they always stopped when I'd shut it. I'd have friends over to hang out sometimes and tell them and show them, and that they were all supremely freaked out. I'm not sure what anyone else will think of this, but I was certainly convinced that there was something paranormal going on in that room. I'd like to start by saying I am a skeptic. As a child, my father always gave my brother and me the freedom to choose whatever we wanted to be, which allowed me to think critically and look at the world from the most logically explainable standpoint. So, all of this is just as confusing to me now as it was when I was witnessing it as a child or teenager. My parents weren't around much when I was a kid. My dad worked day and night as an aerospace engineer at the University of Michigan, and my mother simply wanted nothing to do with me. So, my brother and I spent a lot of time with our grandfather in his big Victorian-style house. My grandmother had a passion for antiques, so the house was decorated in that style. During the odd times I lived there, my grandparents were separated. My grandmother was living in North Carolina for over 8 years, leaving my grandfather to care for the big, empty house. I loved staying there as a kid because I practically had no bedtime, and I spent most of Friday through Sunday watching anime and eating whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I was pretty isolated as a kid, and it was the perfect distraction for someone like me who didn't have any friends to hang out with. That said, the very first time I ever saw her was on one of those nights. Another thing I neglected to mention is that my room at my grandparents' house was full of dolls. If I remember correctly, my grandma had over 300 Barbies, all still in their boxes, along with a small collection of porcelain dolls and this antique chair with a bunch of Raggedy Ants sitting on it. It never really bothered me, but my brother refuses to set foot in that room. I guess I'm just not one of those people who's scared of dolls. In the past, I'd had issues with that chair full of Raggedy Hands, particularly when I'd leave my room and come back and all of the dolls that I just stacked up nicely and by size from big to small were laying on the floor all of a sudden. I just assumed it was my grandma's cat using the chair to get up into the window and maybe she just knocked them all over in the process. But it became more of an issue when it was happening even when I'd shooed the cat out, close my door, and wake up to all the raggedy ants on the floor again. It was about 2 in the morning on either Friday or Saturday, and I was starting to feel drowsy. So I shut off Toonami and went into my room. It seemed like a typical weekend for 12-year-old me, you know? I turned on my little night light, got in the bed with a glass of water next to me, took off my glasses, then shut off the light. When I laid there, eyes shut, I could feel myself drifting off in the sleep, listening to the silence of the house only to be woken up by the sound of those dolls hitting the floor as they fell off the chair at the foot of my bed. I got this strange tingling sensation on the back of my neck, but due to my stubbornness, I kept reassuring myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was just one of the dolls being unbalanced and causing a dolly avalanche or whatever. I kept trying to sleep, focusing on the familiar noises of my surroundings in the dark. The sound of the grandfather clock out in the hallway ticking, my grandpa snoring in the other room, the occasional popping sounds of the old house settling. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary yet. I had the strangest gut feeling ever, so I sat up to get a sip of water in hopes of calming myself. When I sat my glass back down on the nightstand, I looked up from where I sat only to meet eyes with a small child sitting in the chair across from my bed. She smiled at me, then looked back down at whatever she was doing. In my head, I'm trying to rationalize this like, oh, maybe she's a friend of the family. But no, that still wouldn't explain why she's sitting in my bedroom at 2 a.m. So I had to be dreaming, right? I went to take off my glasses to rub my eyes only to remember that I had already taken my glasses off and they were sitting on the nightstand. I could see this person perfectly even though everything else around her was blurry in the dim light of the night light. I rubbed my eyes almost frantically thinking I had officially gone crazy or something, but when I looked back up to the chair, she was gone. I got no sleep that night and finally passed out when the sun was coming up, and I didn't tell a single soul about it until I was about 16 and the topic of the paranormal came up at breakfast one day. My brother, grandma, and I were all sat at the table chatting after eating, and my grandma brought up that the house was haunted. She's very superstitious. And my brother mentioned being in the kitchen a few months ago and seeing the little girl standing at the top of the stairs when he looked over from where he stood. I'll tell you, when he told me that, I nearly soiled myself because I'd been bottling what I saw for years, and I immediately spilled the beans to him about it. Just the fact that we both saw the same girl during very different time periods freaks me out for some reason. But the thing is, things got worse after that. During my teens, things got rough for my family. Things were not good at home. My mom was caught cheating on my dad. My brother left, and no one knew where he went, and I was in a very deep depression. My grandpa had finally made the decision to move down to North Carolina to be with my grandma, and their house here in Michigan sat empty for years. But that house wasn't empty before. I'd start driving by then, so I'd take my little beater car over to their empty house and just sit in the formal living room on the ugly floral print couches in silence. I would go there as my escape place to cry about all the awful things going on in my life, and I would cry to the cat that had been left behind that I'd been feeding and caring for. It's like the house would almost soak up my emotions, and the only way I could describe it is like when you wring out a sponge into a bucket. My feelings being the soapy water trapped in the sponge and the house being the bucket. There was a day I'd gotten out of school and was upset, so I drove to that house and went into the old room and cried. When I was all out of tears, I started going through all of my antique wardrobes and dressers in search of my old ballet shoes, or really any other memories stowed away from when I was a kid. When I opened one of the smaller drawers and found a medical bracelet from the 70s with the name on it. The name read Casey. My middle name is Casey. I got out my phone and immediately called my mom about it. At the time, I wasn't really on speaking terms with my mother, so it was a bit of a rough phone call, but it was one that made me understand some things a little bit better. My mother had a little sister named Casey who died at a very young age. I guess when Casey was conceived, my grandmother had an IUD but got pregnant anyway. She decided to have the baby regardless of all the health issues that the baby would have. Casey died before she turned 3 due to related health complications, and during the autopsy, they found the IUD inside of her instead of my grandmother. Learning this information broke my heart, and while I understand why no one wanted to talk about it, it would have been nice to know that my middle name had that kind of significant meaning. After taking a bit to let all of this soak in, I decided to go back up to my old room and look for more of Casey's things. The other thing I found was a picture of Casey. I sat on the floor looking at this photo for a long time. In the corner of my room was a full-body mirror, and I scooted closer to it and held the picture up. I thought I was the only person in my family to have red hair and blue eyes. My parents, grandparents, and brother all have brown hair and brown eyes, but I realized just how much I look like Casey. I looked myself in the eyes and began to cry, feeling overwhelmed with this somber realization that the reason my mom resented me so much was because I looked like her dead sister. I held the photo and bracelet close to me and whispered, "Casey, I'm so sorry. I wish we could have met." And when I closed my eyes, I felt the strange sensation on the top of my head that I can only describe as a kiss, and then the house felt empty. Like actually empty this time in a way that I had never felt before, as if the weight was gone. I didn't go back there for a long time. Things went back to normal, though my version of normal at the time was not normal at all. But those stories are for a different time. I spent more time at home putting up with my family until the next year. My grandparents started talking about selling their house in Michigan and just living in North Carolina instead. It was around fall of the next year that I finally went back to that house again. I don't recall exactly what I had gotten into a fight with my mom about that time, but I was angry enough to pack a backpack up and leave. When I walked into the foyer, I noticed a lot of things that had already been in disrepair before my grandparents left had now turned into full-on decay. The paint on the walls began chipping off like brittle eggshells, and the house now smelled like mothballs and black mold as the basement had begun to leak regularly. The cupboards had bugs and mice scurrying about them, and some of the trees in the backyard had fallen dangerously close to the house. When I walked into my old room, it was like nothing had changed from when I was a kid, though. It was like a little time capsule of dolls, doilies, and lace curtains. I could feel it, though. She was gone. It was colder in there. I set down my bag next to the bed, and I remember taking off my shoes and just sitting, not really doing anything, just sitting in silence for a long time. The grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped since no one was here to wind it back up. I knew that I probably shouldn't sleep in this empty house, but everything else going on in my life was kind of horrible. And I thought that at least here I wouldn't have to face the wrath of my mother's abuse. The thing is, I thought very wrong. It was a mistake sleeping there. If there was something I could change, it would be this event, because even now, 7 years later, I'm still traumatized by what happened. I put on some pajama pants and turned on my nightlight, which was already on its last legs. The thing flickered on and off if you brushed against it lightly, but I didn't care. I just wanted that sense of nostalgia and belonging again. It was all I had left because I felt like I had literally no one. When I climbed into bed, the sheets felt musty, and the metal bed frame creaked every time I moved, but I managed to turn off the lights and fall asleep for a bit. Then I woke up. I couldn't move. My body felt numb, and the room was dark except for the dim light from the nightlight. I didn't know what sleep paralysis was at the time, so I had no idea what was happening. I started to panic when I looked down at the end of the bed and saw a black figure with white eyes staring at me. It was crouched at the foot of the bed, its hands resting on either side of my feet. I couldn't make out the details of its long, stick-like fingers against the white comforter. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I had to watch as the sickly, skinny creature slowly draped its long arms over my feet and grabbed them, pulling them just a little. I started hyperventilating. Once it was on the bed, it crawled toward me, moving with jerky, unsettling motions, its joints cracking and popping with every movement. I couldn't see its mouth, but as it got closer to my face, all I could hear was its raspy breath, accompanied by coughing and cackling. Its breath was so foul it nearly made me vomit, but that's what finally snapped me out of the sleep paralysis. I jerked awake, and when I looked around, the room was empty. The house was empty. There was nothing there but me. Needless to say, I left, and I haven't been back since. Honestly, I kind of hope they tear that house down. Like I said, I'm a skeptic, but even I can admit that there's something seriously wrong with that place. The house had one more room than it should have. When I moved in, I counted 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small office, and a living room. It matched the listing. But as I unpacked, I noticed a door at the end of the hallway that hadn't been there before. I tried to tell myself I had missed it. Maybe I was too distracted to notice when I first arrived. But the more I looked at it, the more certain I became. It shouldn't have been there. The door was plain, wooden, painted the same color as the walls, as if someone had tried to make it disappear. There was no handle, no keyhole, just a door. I ignored it at first, focused on unpacking, on settling in. But every time I walked past it, a weight settled in my stomach, a pressure I couldn't explain. And then, one night, I heard something on the other side. It started as a faint rustling, a whisper of movement, like fabric shifting, something stirring just beyond the door. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then, a knock. Not loud, not urgent, just steady. I stumbled backward, my breath coming fast. My mind raced for explanations. Pipes? Settling wood? But deep down, I knew better. Something was in that room, and it wanted out. I slept in the living room that night, as far from the door as possible. The knocking didn't come again, but I felt it. The weight of it, like something was waiting. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, until I walked down the hallway. The door was open, just a crack. A sliver of darkness stretched beyond it, deep, endless. I stopped in my tracks, my entire body screaming at me to turn around. But something was wrong. The air was heavy, too still. The walls, the floor, everything felt off. I took a slow step closer, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then the door moved, not swung open, not pushed, pulled itself wider. And from the blackness inside, something moved. A shape, just a shadow at first, shifting like liquid, stretching toward the threshold. I ran. I locked the bedroom door behind me, shoving a dresser against it for good measure. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. From the hallway, the air seemed to shift. The silence deepened. Then came the sound. Soft, slow, footsteps. Not mine. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. A pause. Then, a whisper so faint I barely heard it. Let me in. The handle rattled gently at first, then harder. I didn't sleep. I barely breathed. At some point, the rattling stopped. The whispering faded. But the silence that replaced it was worse. By morning, the house was quiet again. But I knew I couldn't stay. I packed whatever I could fit into my car. I didn't go near the hallway. I didn't look at the door. But as I was leaving, just as I stepped outside, I heard it again. The door creaking open. I turned back just once. The hallway stretched on longer than it should have, impossibly deep, fading into shadow. And standing just beyond the threshold of that last room, something watched me go. It was smiling. Then, just before I turned away, it took a step forward. I'm 23 and currently living alone. Sleep paralysis and night terrors are so common for me that I can usually recognize them instantly and break free from them on my own. But a few nights ago, I experienced something completely different. It started when I woke up in the middle of the night, reaching for my phone and seeing that it was roughly 4 a.m. I'm a light sleeper, so waking up randomly like this is something that's always been annoying, but also pretty common. I sighed, knowing my alarm would go off in just 2 hours. I thought I should try to fall back asleep, so I kept telling myself to stop trying so hard and let sleep come to me. I even attempted meditation, but the more I focused, the more I could feel my brain waking up, uncontrollably racing through everything I needed to do the next day. Realizing it wasn't going to work, I accepted it and decided to at least rest my eyes. I curled up on my side, facing the edge of the bed. Then, suddenly, Clear as day, I felt the mattress sink behind me as if someone had sat down on my bed. My eyes shot open. I froze, confused and terrified. I felt the spot where the mattress had shifted, and I could hear the sheets shuffle as if someone was dragging themselves across my bed behind me. I stayed perfectly still, shutting my eyes tight, trying to regulate my breathing and heartbeat. I told myself that as long as I could convince whatever it was that I was asleep, it would leave me alone. But the presence kept moving closer, closer, until it touched my back. I fought the urge to gasp, not daring to open my eyes for fear of what I might see. I almost pictured a haunting face leaning over mine, and I didn't want to face that. It felt like they were waiting for confirmation that I was really asleep before they backed off. I let out a sigh of relief disguised as one of those grunts you make while sleeping, but I could still feel them sitting on my bed behind me. I slowly opened my eyes but didn't move a muscle. Trying not to move my head or neck, I looked around the room with my very limited field of vision. It's not real, I thought. It's just a dream. I was sure of it because I knew that if it had been an actual intruder, I wouldn't have reacted the way I did. I would have tried to put up a fight, scream for help, or escape. But then I thought, why is that spot on my bed still sunken in? I looked around the room again. From what I could see, everything looked just as it should, exactly like my room. You know how, when you recall a dream that takes place in your room, things always seem just a little off? Well, I was certain I was looking at my room with my own eyes, so it had to be real. It wasn't a dream. Then what was all of a sudden I felt a light tug on my duvet. I flinched, gasped, and closed my eyes, but it was too late. The person began pulling my duvet violently once they realized I was awake. I screamed and kicked and cried as I mustered up all the strength within myself to keep the duvet over myself. The entire time I didn't dare turning around to see who it was or what it was. I just pulled, kicked and wailed in the same curled up position, keeping my eyes shut, snot and tears covering my face. For some reason I believed if I let the thing pull my duvet away and expose myself I'd be a goner. Then, as suddenly as it all occurred, it all stopped. I opened my eyes again and saw that the sky was brightening up. I sat up and looked at my bed and around my room. I was fully covered by my duvet. There was no sign of a tug of war ever taking place. There was no snot or tears on my face. I was sweating and my heart was beating out of my chest. What was that? I was beyond baffled. Usually when I see my room in my dream, I will remember how off it looked once I have woken up. But this time, nothing about the room I just saw seconds ago looked off to me. I was sure I was looking at my room with my own eyes and the mattress sinking. It all felt so real. Perhaps my eyes were really open and looking at my room in reality. But my exhausted brain somehow slipped into that realm between dreamland and consciousness and created this juxtaposition of reality and imagination. But I am open to any other explanations.